Good morning, all. Welcome to the last day of the meeting. We again have special to the day exhibits in the cases to both sides of the stage. In the case on stage left are two letters from prominent early American women, one of whom is a subject of one of today's meeting talks, to Sarah Franklin Bache, Benjamin Franklin's daughter. Also included is a 1710 letter from William Penn. On stage right are materials relating to quantum physics and theoretical physics, many of which come from the APS's archive for the history of quantum physics. As always, I'm sure by now you're used to turning off your cell phone, but just in case you have forgotten, please do so. We'll now induct some more new members.
Will Professor Andrew Balmford please come forward to the President's desk to sign the roll book and then receive a formal welcome from the President? Mr. President, I have the honor to present Andrew Balmford, Professor of Conservation Science at the Department of Zoology at the University of Cambridge. As a conservation scientist, his research focuses on evaluating the costs and benefits of conservation to help guide decision-making towards the best outcomes for nature conservation and farming. In his book, Wild Hope, Professor Balmford argues that cautious, evidence-based optimism is vital to tackling environmental challenges. His work was adapted by PBS into a series of television programs highlighting positive stories about protecting the Earth from biodiversity loss and climate change. Professor Balmford helped found the Cambridge Conservation Forum, which includes a network of 70 organizations whose primary focus is the conservation of biodiversity.
By the authority and in the name of the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge, I do admit you a member thereof. Congratulations.
Oh, this way. Thank you. Welcome. Will Dr. William G. Kalin please come forward to the President's desk to sign the roll book and then receive a formal welcome from the President? Mr. President, I have the honor to present William Kalin, Sidney Farber Professor of Medicine in the Department of Medicine at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and Harvard Medical School. His research seeks to understand how, mechanistically, mutations affecting tumor-suppressing genes cause cancer. His long-term goal is to lay the foundation for new anti-cancer therapies based on the biochemical functions of tumor-suppressing proteins. His work on the VHL protein led to successful clinical testing of VEGF inhibitors and the first HIF2 inhibitor for the treatment of kidney cancer, providing broader insights into cell response to changes in oxygen and the implications for diseases beyond cancer. In 2019, Dr. Kalin was awarded the Nobel Prize for his work on the ways in which cells sense and adapt to oxygen availability.
By the authority and in the name of the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge, I do admit you a member thereof. Congratulations. Yeah. Thank you.
Will Dr. Ernest Moniz please come forward to the President's desk to sign the roll book and then receive a formal welcome from the President? Mr. President, I have the honor to present Ernest Moniz, former United States Secretary of Energy, Cecil and Ida Green Emeritus Professor of Physics and Engineering Systems at MIT, and founder and CEO of the EFI Foundation. As Energy Secretary under Barack Obama, Dr. Moniz was tasked with implementing strategies for economic growth, enhancing security, and protecting the environment. Under his leadership, the Department of Energy implemented bipartisan energy policy proposals and negotiated the 2015 Iran nuclear agreement alongside former Secretary of State John Kerry. The EFI Foundation, which Dr. Moniz co-founded in 2017, is a nonprofit dedicated to educating the public on issues relating to harnessing the power of technology and policy innovation to accelerate the clean energy transition.
By the authority and in the name of the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge, I do admit you a member thereof. Congratulations.
Thank you. Congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Will Dr. Christine Edry Seidman please come forward to the President's desk to sign the roll book, and then receive a formal welcome from the President. Mr. President, I have the honor to present Christine Seidman, Thomas W. Smith Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School, and founder and director of the Cardiovascular Genetics Service at Brigham and Women's Hospital. Along with her lifelong collaborator and husband, John Seidman, Dr. Seidman pioneered discovery of the genetic basis for human heart muscle diseases. These discoveries allowed the development of clinical gene-based diagnostics, which are now standard of care, and enabled preemptive interventions to prevent sudden cardiac death from cardiomyopathies. By targeting biophysical consequences of the human gene mutations on cardiac functions, Dr. Seidman's work has led to the first FDA-approved mechanism-based medicine for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy.
By the authority and in the name of the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge, I do admit you a member thereof. Congratulations. Got it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rick.
Does it? Yep. Okay. Caroline Bynum.
Sir?
Oh. Apologies. Last but not least, I have to say this is the one I've been the most nervous about all week. Can I say Goethe? All right. Will Dr. David Welberry please come forward to the President's desk to sign the roll book and then receive a formal welcome from the President? Mr. President, I have the honor to present David Welberry, Leroy T. and Margaret Deffenbaugh Carlson University Professor in the Department of Germanic Studies and the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. He directs the University of Chicago Center for Interdisciplinary Research on German Literature and Culture. Dr. Welberry's research explores the age of Goethe and the age of idealism in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, examining the ramifications of the epistemological revolution of that period on contemporary thought. His books on semiotics and aesthetics in the Age of Reason, on Johann von Goethe and Romanticism, and his edited volume, Positions in Literary Studies, are core materials in German literary history and literary theory of German literature. Dr. Welberry was awarded the Golden Goethe Medal by the Goethe Society in Weimar, Germany in 2019 in recognition of his contributions to scholarship on Goethe.
By the authority and in the name of the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge, I do admit you a member thereof. Congratulations.
Thank you, David. Thanks. Now we're done.
Okay. Great. I have the pleasure now to turn the podium over to Vice President Caroline Bynum, who will preside over the next session.
Thank you, Roger, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to the last day. And for our first session of the last day, we have a special conversation between two leaders in higher education, exploring their experiences leading institutions, as well as their understandings and views on the role of historically Black colleges and universities at this moment and in the future of our country. The first of our two panelists is Ben Vinson, who has served as president of Howard University since 2023, following appointments as provost and executive vice president of Case Western Reserve University. During his tenure at Case Western, Dr. Vinson led strategic planning initiatives promoting leadership development and diversity in the humanities. Beyond his role in university leadership, Dr. Vinson is a historian studying African diaspora with a focus on Latin American history and culture. His latest book, Frank Etheridge, Musician of the African Diaspora, chronicles Etheridge's experience playing in interracial orchestras and for mixed audiences abroad during America's Jim Crow era. Our second panelist, Beverly Tatum, is President Emerita of Spelman College and former interim president of Mount Holyoke College. Dr. Tatum's 13 years as president of Spelman College were marked by innovation and growth. Her visionary leadership, under which the Center for Leadership and Civic Engagement was created and the annual Women of Culture Leadership Conference was established, was recognized with the Carnegie Academic Leadership Award in 2013. A clinical psychologist, Dr. Tatum researches the impact of race in the classroom, racial identity development, and strategies for creating inclusive campus environments. She was elected to the APS in 2024. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists, Ben Vinson and Beverly Tatum.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you, President Vinson, for being in this conversation. One of the things that I wanted to say at the start is that I have a new book coming out in September. Shameless plug. But the book is, this is the galley copy, Peril and Promise, College Leadership in Turbulent Times. And when I picked that title, I had no idea how much peril there would actually be. But there is still plenty of promise, and we are going to be talking about some of that promise today. I have had the opportunity to work with Ben in a variety of contexts, most recently in an institute that encourages academic leaders. It's known as the Academic Leadership Institute, happens every summer at Swarthmore College, and was really excited when Ben was selected to be president of Howard University. So I'm really delighted we're going to have this conversation together. And I want to start by sharing a piece of advice that I was given when during my own professional development, I had mentors of various kinds, and one of them was a college president who told me that if you're thinking about being a college president, you need to know that you can't be president of just any college. It has to be one that you truly love. It has to be the right fit. Because, she said, it's a really hard job, and in the end, you will do a lot for your lover. And I thought that was a great analogy. And certainly spoke to me as I thought about where I wanted to exercise my leadership. And so I want to use that to ask you, Ben, what brought you to Howard University?
Well, I think that's a marvelous insight. I have to totally agree with you. Before I share my remarks, I would like to also just to thank this group for having this conversation. I think this is an important time for us to be talking about higher ed, but also to be thinking about and remembering the potential that we have as institutions, and particularly HBCUs. So for me, my story with Howard really begins, as many of these do, with the search firm process. I was happy at Case West Reserve, being provost, but the search firm called and made this opportunity available, or at least letting me know that this opportunity was available. And for me, almost immediately, what struck me was the potential future of Howard building upon its legacy. This is an institution, for those of you who know it well, and there may be others who may not know it as well, whose history has been so integral to the evolution of this country, but also has international tentacles. And so I had a chance to appreciate some of that through some of the work of a friend of mine, Frank Garritti, who you may know at Columbia, other scholars as well, who have studied kind of the trajectory of HBCUs and really helping develop the intellectual capacity and elite of places like the Caribbean, but also on the continent. And so I was almost like an immediate attraction to the institution and its legacy. Howard was founded in 1867. This is a very critical moment in American history, of course, right upon the aftermath of the Civil War, the beginnings of Reconstruction, and a group of Congregationalists from New England went and convened in Washington, D.C. as part of the Reconstruction effort, and began to conceive of an institution, and like many in this age, perhaps it was to train ministers, perhaps it was to do more, and soon evolved into a type of institution where it was kind of conceived as a comprehensive institution to help freedmen find a place in the emerging society. And that promise, Beverly, is etched into the core of the institution. And it's something that, as a historian myself, really, really made an impression upon me. And thinking about those foundings, those early days, and thinking about the moments that we have been living through, that optimism and hope and promise for rebuilding America, restoring values of truth and service, which are core anchor elements of the creed of Howard. These are things that were undeniable and certainly alluring to me. And I don't know if you had that similar, kind of call.
Well, yes. The short answer is yes. And I, in the spirit of full disclosure, I am a Howard baby, which means that my parents, both my mother and father, attended Howard and graduated in the class of 1949. So that's what I mean when I call myself a Howard baby. But certainly, when I was considering whether I wanted to be president of Spelman College, I had never visited the campus. And so I made what I call my secret visit to Spelman, and I just walked around anonymously. But I went to the admissions office and I picked up a brochure, and on that brochure there was a description of the mission of the institution. And there was a sentence in that description. It talked about the ways in which women who come to Spelman are transformed by that experience. And then there was a sentence that said, "This is your heritage and your call." And I thought, it is. I mean, it just spoke to me. And so there was definitely that sense of wanting to continue that tradition of leadership and that legacy.
I don't know about you, but for me, jumping into the process, being successful, I wasn't sure that, I'm different from some of the Howard presidents that have come before me, so I wasn't sure it was going to work out.
Yeah.
So I was pleasantly surprised when it did. But for me, the love affair has only grown, and it really is anchored in the students and the alumni, and every day that I walk our yard, I see our future, and I'm optimistic. And I was sharing this last week with members of my cabinet. When many of the things that we're going through at this time started, I spoke with one of our students who said that this is a time where America needs to inspect itself to get better. And so that optimism in our student body is something that just is boundless and something that really re-energizes me on the job. So.
Well, during this time of challenge, and there are a lot of challenges, as we know, but during this time of challenge, that kind of moment with students does renew the spirit, keeps you going, and of course there's a lot of opportunity. And I know that one of the opportunities that has come to Howard, we'll talk about the fact that, every opportunity has its downside, that you'll hear soon, but the opportunity was for Howard to become a Research One institution, an R1. And why was that so important? Clearly, let me just put that in context for our audience. Howard at this moment is the only HBCU that is an R1. So achieving that status was quite significant. But why was that so important?
I think for Howard, and I think also for HBCUs that are also working and striving to be R1, I should note that there is a cluster of HBCUs that are on a path, what we call R2 to R1, that are striving for this status, and in the next few years we'll see more. But for Howard, it is a validation of the work that's being done on campus. It really is I think, a kind of a highway to future validation of the type of innovation and excellence in research that Howard has brought for many, many years. For us, it was a journey that we started on in very much in earnest in about 2018 or so, when we focused on this effort to become an R1 institution. We had a lot of research being done. But we knew that through creating a research office, a sponsored research office, through figuring out other ways which we could support our faculty to boost their work, their scholarship, that this would be something that was within sights. What I see as symbolic about Howard being an R1 is that it really puts a marker on something that I'm calling the next generation HBCU, or next gen HBCU. And what I mean by that is that there's a solution set, there's a methodology, there are forms of conversations that happen on the campus of HBCUs, and Howard specifically, that are very different than the types that I have seen in my journey in academia. And I've been to many institutions recently, Provost at Case Western Reserve. I see colleagues from Johns Hopkins here, where I served as well. Amazing places. But one of the things that I have seen at Howard is that the dedication and focus to issues of social justice, equity, and trying to reconcile disparities is something that you can go to from any department, any school, and there's a common language. And sometimes the approaches that are utilized to investigate these areas have inhabited the margins of the research enterprise. But now, with this particular status, that form of thinking, this campus-wide conversation and focus, what I call it is a broad focus. Throughout the campus, anyone at any time can be talking about these issues in a very broad way, but they're all focused on these particular outcomes. That, which is the element of a next generation HBCU, is something that is being validated, being supported with additional resources, and in some ways turbocharged for the benefit of our society. New innovative solutions through Howard University and through other HBCUs to come will be a part of the Rolodex of possibilities for our society to continue to confront many of the investigative challenges that we face. And so this is a signal moment from my point of view, because it is a marker of a next generation HBCU, and it helps us in our journey.
Well, it is a great moment, and it is a signal moment, as you said, but it does have, as they say, timing is everything, right?
Yes.
And there is a challenge about this particular time to be a Research One institution. And I want to put this in the context of the historic partnership between the federal government and research universities, which really goes back to the end of World War II. I know that many people in this audience will be familiar with that history, but in case there are those who are not, I want to mention that if we rewind to the end of World War II, Vannevar Bush, a physicist and scientist who was advisor to Harry Truman, pushed for science as the next great American frontier, and argued that in order to really achieve the scientific accomplishments that the next generation and generations after would need, the most efficient way to do that would be to partner with universities, because the universities already had scientists, they already had lab facilities, and that partnership would be better than the government trying to build its own, right? Independent federal institutes was not the way to go, he argued. And in fact, that's what happened. And what we think of today as, or thought of today as the methodology in terms of the National Science Foundation, NIH, et cetera, all of that has its roots in this decision back after World War II to partner the government and research institutions. And one of the things I learned when I was working on my book was that indirect costs were, I will confess, as a college president, somewhat of a mystery to me. But what I learned was that the indirect costs, what was a mystery was why they varied so much, right? You know, one institution has one level of indirect costs and another one has a different level. But what I came to understand was that the calculation of those indirect costs is based on the investment that the institution has already made to its infrastructure. So those institutions that have spent a lot of money, whether that's fundraised or otherwise, but non-federal dollars, creating the infrastructure for their science and their research, receive a higher rate of indirect cost than those who have less infrastructure, or for whom, I'm going to use Spelman as an example. Spelman has a fabulous undergraduate science center, much of it built with federal dollars, and therefore it doesn't count toward the indirect cost rate because the federal government paid for it. That said, regardless of what your institution is, a 15% indirect cost rate is not going to cover your expenses. And so that that situation that many institutions are confronted with right now, just as you've become an R1, I'm wondering what impact that's had for Howard.
Well, I think many of you know the answer to this question, but I certainly joke with my colleagues at Howard that what a fine time to become an R1, right? We couldn't have picked a worse time if we could have. But seriously, to your point, we have put so much money into our research office over the past several years. Since I became president at Howard, one of my top 3 investments from my own discretionary and from university strategic dollars has been in the research enterprise. Mm-hmm. We also were blessed a couple of years ago to get a UARC, which is a university-affiliated research center, where we focus on AI and tactical autonomy. And so it's of course, a government contract. Some of you may know the APL, the biggest of all of these, the Applied Physics Laboratory at Hopkins. Hopefully, in 50 years, we'll have an APL of that scale because those are important for university life. But what's perhaps not as known is that apart from the government investments, we have to make investments. Investments in faculty, investments in buildings, and in additional infrastructure. We are in the process, because we are an HBCU, we've had a unfortunate historic legacy of underfunded labs. Yeah. Buildings that are in bad shape. And so part of our plan over the next several years is to build new labs. And all of this work and investment is, the recovery of that is at risk. Mm-hmm. And so our formulae, as we're going into all of this work, some of this was predicated upon on the indirect cost recovery. Mm-hmm. And now a lot of that ability to invest in the infrastructure that we're investing in is being hit at the knees. Yes. And so for our other HBCUs that are in the R2 to R1 space, slipstream, I like to call it, that work and the recovery of those funds are also in jeopardy. So these are tough times, and we need research urgently. we need the outcomes and the solutions. We have work going on bacteria, how does bacteria survive in various immune systems. We have work going on. We've got cancer goggles looking at different ways in which we can see cancer and deal with it. We're working right now on a variety of AI and quantum areas. And a lot of that work and the early careers of those bright minds of scholars who are bringing new approaches and fresh approaches, a lot of that is right now far more challenging and in this turbulent environment. So it's something we're watching, and it's something we're trying to reconcile. And it's created a much heavier atmosphere for us to work through.
Yeah.
So.
One thing you mentioned, and I want to just lift it up for a moment, is the legacy of underfunding, right, that HBCUs have had to deal with. And I want to lift it up in the context of not Howard. And Howard is in some ways unique because it's the only HBCU that is federally, it was federally funded from the beginning, and much of its funding is federally linked. Certainly, all HBCUs get some federal dollars through what's known as Title III, and that, in the case of Spelman, is probably $4 million a year. So we're talking about relatively small amounts of money, but I want to talk about disparate state funding, which has been really quite notorious. And during the Biden administration, there was an attempt to quantify the level of underfunding. I think the number that they generated going back as far as 1987, not before that, but from 1987 to the present was something like $13 billion.
That's right.
And I was thinking about North Carolina A&T as an example, as one of those R2 to R1 institutions, very close, I'm sure, to achieving R1 status. North Carolina A&T has had prominence in the engineering area in particular, preparing black engineers. And I have a statistic in my head from 2020 where NC A&T, which is one of the largest HBCUs, I think 11,000 plus students, was receiving $8,200 per student from the state of North Carolina, while North Carolina State was receiving $16,400 per student, double. So the underfunding disparity is not something from the past, it continues. And so it's just something I think we should all be aware of when we're talking about HBCUs. But there's some perils that preceded the current moment, and I want to talk about one of those, and that is what has widely been referred to as the enrollment cliff, right? The fact that, as one of people I quoted in my book says, if they weren't born, they're not going to college. Meaning the decline in the birth rate has created a lack of traditionally aged students, right? The population is dropping, and many institutions, small, particularly small, regional, not well-known institutions, are really struggling to meet their enrollment goals. That was true before this current moment. We could talk about the impact of the drop-off in international students and other things that will impact enrollment needs. But this question of students and where are those students coming from is one that Howard has not had to struggle with. I know that you are having a boon in enrollment. The same has been true of Spelman. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about why that is.
I'd be glad to. Before I do want to put a footnote on the underfunding piece that
Yes.
you'd mentioned, because an executive order came out just a couple of days ago. And that executive order actually asks for more investment in HBCUs. And I think it's interesting to see that call and a real call for public-private partnerships and philanthropic investments in HBCUs, but also to correct some of that imbalance. So I urge you to take a look at that. But on the demographic cliff and the demographic explosion that we're feeling, for the past 5 years, Howard's actually grown in size. We are actually well north now, 40,000 applications for 25 to 50 slots per class. And that has been a precipitous, if you will, or certainly a rather steep incline in our application base. And we think that some of what's happening is really institutions like Howard, Spelman, Morehouse are undergoing a bit of a renaissance. And some of that has to do with these are culturally affirming spaces for individuals of African American descent. But what's also not known is how many individuals we get that are also international. We get students from the Middle East, from Latin America. Historically, we've had students from China and Russia. But in this particular moment, these are spaces that are truly affirming in an unapologetic way for African American culture, and where students of our background are thriving.
Yes.
And people are also looking at the ROI that's taking place. Howard is over 40% Pell eligible. Institutions that I've been at before we're celebrating being at 17, 18%. And so there's a corridor of opportunity for those who are more marginalized to really achieve through the corridors of a Howard. And in fact, a Carnegie classification was just announced yesterday, in fact, that measures universities on a continuum for success and a return on investment and kind of social mobility. And Howard leads HBCUs there, and it's a very interesting index, and I invite all of you to look and see where your university is. There's a little tool where you can just move the dots or put in your institution, and you can see where you fall. Howard's doing extraordinarily well. HBCUs are doing very well overall. And that's why, one reason why students are coming. It's a mixture of the outcome and results, the care that's happening at the institutions, and then really the opportunities that are opened up that are tremendous. What we need to do as HBCUs, and what I see as part of my mission, is to strengthen our institutions from the core.
Yes.
Because the decades of neglect has weakened us internally. We can be even stronger, deliver even better when we strengthen our core. And so that's something that I've been focusing on.
I used to talk about that, maybe it's our Pilates background. But I used to talk about strengthening the core. And
I need a little work.
I used to talk about strengthening the core when I was at Spelman, and not unlike Howard, Spelman also has seen that kind of dramatic incline. When I started as president there in 2002, and putting this in the context of women's colleges, right, it's a women's college, with an entering class of about 500, the application rate in 2002 was 3,000. And that, coming from Mount Holyoke, I thought was pretty good. It was a higher application rate than Mount Holyoke had at that time. And today, last year, it was 11,000. So for a class of roughly the same size. So we've seen a dramatic increase. And I used to say to students when they came that this is a place built for you, right? And that the fact of being able to walk into a place where you are able to say, this place was built for me, and it's nothing less than the best, was something that was very appealing, I think, and continues to be. I'm getting the signal that we are going to Q&A, and I want to say this before we start. Caroline's going to moderate our Q&A, that there are some questions that past presidents can answer more easily than current presidents. I just want to acknowledge that. So with that in mind, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, that was such a wonderful job of asking questions and answering them. I'm hesitant to break in, except that we have a wonderful audience, and I'm sure the audience will have many questions too. So we're open to questions. Please state your name and where you're coming from before you state your question. Yes, here.
Great, thanks. I'm Susan Engel from Massachusetts, and actually from the birthplace of W.E.B. Du Bois. And that brings me to my question. So you talked about the commitment after World War II to the federal government's support of science. And this is going to sound like blasphemy to everybody here. I'm a scientist. But you also talked about the special role, the environment at Howard being one of a commitment to social justice. And it occurred to me listening to you that one of the things we might need to switch is a federal government to equally rigorous investigation of social justice. And I wondered if you could talk a little about how you balance the commitment to federal funding, or anywhere we can get it, for scientific inquiry with the commitment you've made and that you see as important to the inquiry about social justice.
I think that's a past president question. And certainly it's true at Spelman and other places. Throughout my career, a focus on social justice has been important, and I think we're at a moment when it is challenging for people who want to do that work, even to talk. I mean, you know, the E in DEI is equity, right? And the focus on removing DEI references on websites and in grants and all those things make it a difficult conversation to have. That said, I think that one can assert one's values in lots of different ways, and that the value of social justice is essential. And particularly at HBCUs, it's the core of its founding. You know, what's the purpose of an HBCU? It's to create opportunity for people who have been denied it. That is the history, and it continues to be the reality, though many HBCUs are much more diverse than you might anticipate. In fact, some HBCUs are now predominantly white. There are not very many in that category, but there are some. So the HBCU moniker references its history, not necessarily its current population.
And while that is a past president question, I will note as well that there are spaces for important work to be done. And what comes to mind immediately for me is some of the work in technology and in AI. And this is something that is, first of all, it's also a prerogative of the administration, but it's also, it is very important to our future. And it is critical for us to get these systems right, lest we suffer as a human population. And so this is something that we're taking on frontally, trying to develop different ways of thinking about coding, different types of relationships with, for instance, we have a new partnership with ChatGPT. I know Harvard and Oxford and others do as well, but you should know that our slant is kind of in this area. And as well, we also have trainings in our data science program, computer science, that also talk about ways in which we can have more equitable systems and socially responsible systems. So these are very important areas as well that we should not ignore.
If I could exercise, moderator's prerogative here, I did want to ask a question about AI, and your response has triggered that for me, because we know that the advances in AI are, dramatic, happening at great speed. I'm wondering what Howard is doing to prepare students for this AI revolution.
There are a couple things. And first of all, I actually wear AI on myself. This is an AI transcriber, which I'm not using right now. But at Howard,
So tell people how that works, because it's fascinating.
Oh, so this is
if you don't know.
Sure, it's a wearable AI called Plod, and basically it takes conversations and creates summaries for me, very, very good summaries that I can then use, and it has action items in different meetings. So it's very, very nice companion to have around. But at Howard specifically, we have developed an AI council. And so we are also just completed an AI policy for the institution, which helps us think through how we utilize curriculum and what ways we are actually able to leverage the technology for faculty, staff, et cetera. So this is something that, from a governance standpoint, that's important for Howard. And for students, we are also making sure that certain programs, again, computer science is one, that we are also making sure that there's an AI facility capability amongst our students, a kind of an AI familiarity. And apart from that, we've set up certain partnerships with industry, such as with Google, where our students who may go through a academic curriculum will also partner with Google and other companies to make sure that they have those ready skills, market-ready skills, that will allow them to be successful in tech firms. And so these are just a few of the avenues, and we're also working on the K-12 space. We've developed a partnership with something called the National Equity Lab, where we have courses in mathematics and data science that also introduce these elements that really get the future generations of students, wherever they may go, more familiar with not with just the consumer use of the technology, but really what's behind the creation and application of the technology.
Great.
There's a hand in the
Questions?
back.
Good. Yeah, Howard.
Hi, I'm another Howard Gardner from Cambridge, and I profited from this conversation. Most of the people here still have what I would call a Humboldtian view of higher ed, that liberal arts is very important, that people should have their minds expanded for disciplines and ways of thinking that they may not have been exposed to before. I'll use philosophy as an example. And I guess I'd like to know, assuming that most of your students and most of our students generally don't come to college with that vision, and their parents would almost never mention it. In fact, they don't know what liberal arts is, and I can give you 2,000 bits of data on that. What's your own thinking about the more classical views of what a higher education should be about, and how can that be preserved if it should be, and if not, how do we say goodbye gracefully?
I'm happy to speak to that. I think either one of us could, but it seems to me, I have to speak from the perspective of someone who attended a small liberal arts college and have worked, not counting my PhD, which was from the University of Michigan, but as an undergraduate attended a small liberal arts college, Wesleyan University, and have spent my entire teaching and administrative career in small liberal arts institutions. Clearly, I have a bias in that direction, so I just want to acknowledge that. But I think it is possible to both encourage the kind of critical thinking and expansive problem solving that we often associate with a liberal arts college or liberal arts curriculum, and also the practicalities of being, as you said, market ready. Those things are not incompatible. In fact, I think they're quite compatible, because employers are saying what they want are students who can solve problems, who can think critically, who can communicate effectively, who can work effectively with other people across lines of difference. All of these things are part of what you get, whether you're a philosophy major or a computer science major or a psychology major, as I was, or English major, you pick your major. Those things are likely to be part of the experience. What troubles me at this moment, and what I have written some about in my book, is the idea that some ideas should not be available to students. That we shouldn't talk about certain things because it might be, quote, indoctrination. I'm not going to get into the details of it because it would take us too long, But I lift up the example of New College of Florida, for example, which is the Honors College of Florida, whose curriculum is being completely transformed, and the board is completely turned over, and many faculty are being driven out, and gender studies has been eliminated, and all these things under the leadership of Governor Ron DeSantis. And there's, in my mind, there's evidence that some of that response is because some students, and there's one high-profile student I talk about in the book, came to New College of Florida and changed his thinking. That person, I will share this, the student's name is Derek Black. He's the son of Don Black, who was the founder of Stormfront.org, his white nationalist website. Derek Black went to New College of Florida, and after 3 years, he transferred. After 3 years at New College of Florida, renounced that white nationalist ideology, and wrote a very public letter saying that he was wrong and was regretful. And his family said he was suffering from Stockholm Syndrome, right? That he'd been somehow captured. But what had happened was he met people outside his, one of his best friends was a Jewish student who invited him to Seder every Friday, and he changed his thinking about Jewish people as a consequence of that experience. He got to know people of color. He changed his thinking. It became clear to him that the learnings of his family and the organization that he was a part of didn't match his experience, and he had to renounce it. When he did that, it was quite, as you might imagine, quite disruptive to his family relationships and all of that. But he has since written a book about it if you're wanting to learn more. His book is titled The Klansman's Son. The Klansman's Son, published in 2024. But the point I want to make is that his thinking expanded, not because of indoctrinating professors, but the friendships he made outside of his classroom experience. That kind of engagement across lines of difference is core to an excellent education. And many people will say, well, Beverly, how can you say that and also lead an HBCU? You get a lot of diversity in an HBCU community. That's important to say. But to your question, Howard, I think the commitment to holistic education is critically important, regardless of the kind of institution you represent.
Howard, I'll just add quickly to that. And I think, Beverly, you're absolutely right. It's access to ideas that really is that transforms our lives. And I just wanted to remind, and as I do everyone that I get a chance to speak with, that this human odyssey that we are on, the human journey, is an extended conversation with ourselves over time. We have been in constant dialogue with prior ideas to inform how we improve and live the good life, improve our ways to live better lives. It doesn't change because we're in a highly technological age. Those conversations are necessary, a necessary part of our human journey. And so I continually try to remind students, audiences that this is part of who we are, and if we lose that, we do it at our own peril.
And I'll share with you a little backstage information that I just received, which is that the governor's running a bit late, so we have lots of time for questions.
Well then.
And I hope that there will be questions now, because this is such a wonderful conversation. It's good that we can continue. Great. Good. Here and then back there. Yes, you. Right.
Good morning, thank you. Leslie Miller from Philadelphia, by way of South Hadley, Massachusetts.
Good to see you, Leslie.
I can't let Bev Tatum escape without asking her to expand on your comments about the relevance of a liberal arts education to further talk about today's relevance for the education of women in single-sex institutions, particularly at a time when so many of us who have worked to, in our own small ways, advance the position of women today, are asking if we haven't gone full circle and are starting over again.
Well, as they say, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, right? You know, I often make reference to a quote in Dr. King's last book, which is called Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. And in it, he talks about the line of progress is never straight, right? After every period of progress or forward movement, there's pushback against that progress. And clearly, from my point of view, that's what we're experiencing at the moment, right? Pushback against progress. But in much as I was speaking about Spelman as a place built for you, certainly we can say that about women's institutions, Mount Holyoke being one where I spent 13 years of my career very happily and then returned to serve as interim president just a couple of years ago. The idea that being in a place where your identity is celebrated and is not a barrier to opportunity, but in fact where you can see yourself reflected in the environment. You know, students will often say, you know, I came to campus and I saw that the, you know, head of the campus newspaper was a woman. I saw that the leaders across the campus, many, not all, but many of them were women. I saw that every opportunity, I used to say at Spelman, where just sort of that women's experience even further refined in terms of celebrating women of African descent in particular. But when I was president at Spelman, we launched a robotics team. 5 young black women doing robotics, traveling to compete at an international robotics competition in Japan, made an impression on people, right? You know, and would they have had that opportunity anywhere else? Probably not. But certainly, we can see that the role of women in the United States still has not been fully actualized in terms of opportunity. We still are dealing with pay gaps and other kinds of disparities. And so, is there still a need? Is there still a benefit? Absolutely.
Do you want to say something, Dr. Vinson, about gender and progress and reaction there too?
Yes, I just have to completely agree with my colleague, with Beverly, and we just have a lot of work that remains to be done. I mean, that's the you know, that's the fundamentals of it, and it's going to take continued collective work in order to turn things around, and so that's yeah.
I'd like to say something, it's a personal statement, which is to say, I mentioned that both of my parents went to Howard, graduated in 1949. I graduated from high school in 1971. And my mother was keen for me to go to Howard. And I did not want to go to Howard. I didn't want to go to my mother's school. You will appreciate that, right? Right? I didn't want to go to Howard. I didn't want to go to my mother's school. But I grew up in Massachusetts and suffered from the regionalism that comes from thinking that the best schools are in New England. So I went to Wesleyan in Connecticut. That was my preferred choice. Wesleyan in 1971, I graduated from high school in 71. At that time, had just started admitting women. So I was in the second class of women at Wesleyan. I will be celebrating this year, hard to believe, in just a few weeks, my 50th anniversary, the 50th reunion year, graduating in 1975. So now we're 50 years later. Hard to believe that. But having said that, you know, I didn't go to an HBCU. I went to the opposite of a women's college, you might say, because it was largely male, second class of women, and yet, and I had a high school counselor who suggested Mount Holyoke as an option, and I thought, why would I want to do that? That was what I thought, Leslie. I'm so sorry. But when I had the opportunity to teach at Mount Holyoke, which I started teaching there in 1989 in the psychology department, it was so obvious to me how my students were flourishing in that environment. It was really, as a late in life lesson about the power of women's education. And then when I got to Spelman as president, having never attended an HBCU, having worked at that point 13 years at a women's college, but never attending an HBCU, there were some Spelman graduates who were quite suspicious of me. Like, who is this? Never went to an HBCU president from the Northeast coming to our institution. What does she know about us? That there were some women in the community who were a little suspect, thought I was suspect. But I used to say I'm having my HBCU experience late in life, right? Later in life. And of course, I loved the mission of Spelman, still love the mission of Spelman, and it was a great fit. But I say all of this to say my own experience of higher education was not a women's college. It was not an HBCU. It was a small liberal arts college, and then I went from Wesleyan to Michigan, which was about the opposite of a small liberal arts college in terms of its size and scale. And I say all of this to say that the diversity of type and institution in the United States is one of the strengths of American higher education. And the fact that there are so many choices. Wesleyan was a fabulous choice for me. I had a great experience there. And I also see the great benefit that comes to the women who choose to go to Mount Holyoke and Spelman and the other women's institutions, the other HBCUs. So all of this is, I think, a recognition that there is a lot of peril, but much promise in the diversity in the American higher education environment, and we should celebrate that.
Great. I think we have time for one more quick question. The governor is here, so one more quick question.
Well, Susan Fisk, Jamaica, Vermont. My question is, for those of us who have affiliations with predominantly white institutions, what can those institutions learn from HBCUs about how to manage and encourage diversity, DEI things, especially in the current climate where they're forbidden? You must have thought about this.
I have thought a lot about it and write about it in my book. I do want to acknowledge that a judge has just recently, it was in the headlines today, said that the Dear Colleague DEI letter that was sent to higher ed institutions is essentially out of order. And that, so I just want to say that. That said, however, I do think there's something that I talk about the ABCs, I write about them, but the ABCs stand for affirming identity, building community, and cultivating leadership. And I just want to say very quickly what the A represents. I won't go into the B and the C, but the A, affirming identity, is about being seen and recognized, right? Let's imagine we took a photo of this group from this stage and you all got a copy of it. The first thing each of you would do would be look for yourself in the picture, right? Am I right about that? You would look for yourself in that photo, and you'd want to see yourself not only in the picture, but then you would also assess how you look. You want to be in the picture looking good, right? And if we think about our campus communities as like a great big photo that we're all entering into, everyone wants to be seen and wants to be seen looking good. So the one thing that administrators and educators can ask is who's missing from our picture? Is somebody being blocked by the pillar? Is everybody visible and how are they being seen? If we ask ourselves those questions, I think we will improve the climate for everyone.
Yes.
I've got one final insight. I know the governor is here,
Yes.
so. But this comes from insight both working at an HBCU and at what we call PWIs, and predominantly white institutions. And one of the things that I've learned now, having served in both, is that there are ways in which sometimes the work of community, the work of building community, is overloaded on students of color
Yes.
in PWIs. And what happens then is that they're doing twice the work of community building, which then excludes some of their ability to have energy to do some of the work that they need to do to be successful students. And I see this as a major issue, something I tried to work on in my roles at my previous institutions, but something that's different that I see at an HBCU, where that double work that is not there. And so I encourage those of you who have the ability to communicate this to your institutions. That is critically important to support the diverse communities that you have on your campuses.
Thank
So
you
true.
so much for ending with useful advice.
Thank you.
Wonderful panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Well,
Ms. Bogan. There we go.
Those of the members who are fond of reading the laws before voting on their revised version might have noticed that the governor of Pennsylvania is the patron of the American Philosophical Society. This, of course, reflects nothing so much as our deep connection to Pennsylvania and to Philadelphia right from the founding on. But it is rare, despite that we actually have the opportunity to have the governor of Pennsylvania in our halls. So it's a tremendous pleasure to welcome Governor Josh Shapiro to the stage today. Raised near Philadelphia in Montgomery County, Governor Shapiro has dedicated his career to the betterment of the state. After studying political science at the University of Rochester and earning his law degree at Georgetown, Governor Shapiro was elected to the State House of Representatives in 2004. He then served on the Montgomery County Board of Commissioners, serving as chairman, and was appointed chairman of the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency by then Governor Tom Wolf. Governor Shapiro went on to serve as the state's Attorney General, an office he held until elected governor in 2022 and sworn in January of 2023. Today, we are very pleased to have Governor Shapiro here to discuss what it means to govern in the current political landscape of the country. He'll be doing this in conversation with our CEO, Patrick Spero. Governor, welcome.
Thank you.
So, Governor, or patron, thank you for joining us, and thank you to the former patron and current APS member, Tom Wolf, for making this happen. Thank you, Tom. So, do you know what it means to be the patron of the society?
No, and I feel quite inadequate being here with Governor Wolf, who, I mean, that's a legit patron right there, with not only his great work as an elected leader, the governor of the Commonwealth, and to First Lady Wolf as well. We thank you for your service. We thank you for your friendship over so many years. But Governor Wolf also has a PhD. I don't have that. I've got a JD. So I'm not sure that I have any useful knowledge to impart upon you. nor do I feel adequate being here as the patron in line of what Ben Franklin did. But I will do my best here today to impart some knowledge, and you all can decide if it's useful at the end of our conversation.
Yeah. Oh, I might share what it meant in the 18th century and what I think it might mean today.
Please.
In the 18th century, the state chartered the American Philosophical Society because they realized how important it was for an institution like the Philosophical Society to promote knowledge in the early republic, to sustain democracy. And that's why the state wanted to support this organization, and that's why the patron's the governor of it. Today, it means I can't ask any hard questions.
You can ask me whatever you want.
But we pulled out from our library. We have an incredible library across the street, 14 million pages of manuscripts. We have a letter from the founder of Pennsylvania, the first governor, William Penn. And this is a letter he wrote in 1710. So this is almost 30 years after founding Pennsylvania. And you know, when they established Pennsylvania, when they were in England, the Quakers were persecuted. They were imagining this utopia that was going to be across the Atlantic. They all were in the opposition to the reigning power in the United Kingdom, in England. And they imagined a utopia here, because they were all united. As soon as they got to Pennsylvania, they realized there were a lot of things that divided them. And there are all these partisan troubles, there's all this politics happening. This letter that Penn wrote describes to the assembly the cause of many of the troubles and oppressions that he's met with from the assembly. So I want to ask you, what's politics like today in Pennsylvania?
In 30 seconds or less. I want to answer your question. I want to just start with a personal story and sort of my journey in learning about Penn. The first day you get sworn in as governor is very ceremonial. You take the oath of office. I was surrounded by Governor Wolf and former governors. People are wishing you well. And it was an enjoyable day. But the day I was really looking forward to was that first full day where you get to go to work. For me, early in the morning, I arrived in the governor's office, and it was empty, but for a note on the desk from Governor Wolf. My staff had all left me in there. I had literally nothing to do at that moment. The work hadn't started piling up yet. I read Governor Wolf's letter, and then I looked up from behind the desk in the governor's office, which I'd love for you all to come and see. And there's a portrait staring right down at you of William Penn. I've spent a lot of time since that quiet moment I had, and by the way, I've not had a quiet moment since those 30 seconds, thinking about Penn, thinking about why he founded this place, the promise of a place that would be warm and welcoming for all people, particularly people of all different faiths. I'm not sure Penn would have ever imagined American Jewish governor looking down at his portrait here, sitting in that office. But I bet he'd be proud of how we've evolved and how we've grown and how I think we have stayed true to that founding principle of being a place that is warm and welcoming for all. So when you ask me what is politics like today in Pennsylvania, I try and think of all this through the prism of Penn. I read a lot about him. I'm far from a scholar, as so many of you are in this room. But I think a lot about my actions every day, the kinds of bills that I want to get to my desk, the policies I pursue. Would it be the kind of thing that would enforce that message, enforce that hope that Penn had for us when he started, of being a place that would be warm and welcoming for all? Would our classrooms be warm and welcoming for all students? Would our streets be warm and welcoming for all Pennsylvanians and all people seeking more freedom in their lives to come here? Would the jobs be available to more and more people and be warm and welcoming for them? So I think about Penn a lot when we do this kind of work. As for our politics today, I mean, on the surface, you'd have to say Pennsylvania is the swingiest of all swing states, right? It is the determiner of what will happen in our national elections. I would also say it's a microcosm for kind of how people feel in a particular moment. And there's an independence streak that I absolutely love. People talk a lot about what just happened in the national election, that came about, 6 months ago? It feels like 60 years ago. But I remind them that 2 years prior, I won an election for governor by a pretty good amount. And a few years before that, Governor Wolf won an election for governor by a good amount. the point I'm trying to make is you can go back through our modern history of politics, and what you see in Pennsylvanians is an independent streak where they're able to evaluate candidates carefully and thoughtfully, where they're able to vote in one election for Republicans, another election for Democrats. Throughout all, while different messages get sent through our politics, I think that independence streak is something that has remained pretty true and pretty constant, and something that I think is really wonderful and something that is really exhilarating as an elected official, as someone with 13 million bosses out there, that folks are willing to kind of evaluate you on the merits. And while the national politics we have a big impact on, we tend to look at things much more parochially and much more locally, and I enjoy that quite a bit. I'm happy to dive deeper into any of these things, but as I think about Pennsylvania today, our politics today, I think about independence and an independent streak, and the fact that Pennsylvanians understand they have an outsized role in making big decisions, not just for our Commonwealth, but for our country.
Yeah, and in fact, Penn never realizes the harmonious utopia, but the idea of religious liberty and having a door that will welcome people from all over does manifest itself. In 1776, Pennsylvania is probably the most diverse state in terms of population, but also economically. It's the breadbasket. It has all these natural resources. And in 1776, everyone was looking to Pennsylvania for guidance because they knew whichever way Pennsylvania went, so too would the colonies for independence. So it played a central role then, it plays a central role today. When you travel the state, are there values or principles that you see uniting left and right and in between in Pennsylvania?
That's one of the things I love so much about serving as governor, and I would bet something Governor Wolf loved so much. I love getting out of that office with Penn's portrait, not because his portrait is there, but I just enjoy getting out as much as I can, listening to people, meeting them where they are, learning from them. And notwithstanding the way our politics and our governing is described in the media today, all forms of media, where they would want you to think people are so different, we're so divided, things are completely being ripped apart. The reality is, when I get out of the office and I travel around rural, urban, suburban communities, folks are kind of basically the same. The terrain looks different, they may look different, but when you have the deep conversations with them, they all basically want the same four things I have found. They want a really good school for their kids and grandkids because they know that that's the foundation for all opportunity in the future, right? So they want that strong educational system. Second, they just want to know that they're going to be safe in their communities. Now, safety is defined differently depending upon where you live, but they want to know that they can go through life not having to worry about their kids' safety and welfare. Third, they want to know that in the community that they love, in the zip code where they were raised, they can find opportunity for themselves, for their kids, and for their grandkids long into the future, meaning we need to have economic opportunity in all different parts of our communities. Now, sometimes economic opportunity is training to be a farmhand. Other times, economic opportunity is learning, life sciences at, the University of Pennsylvania. It always looks different in terms of what that opportunity is, but what is common throughout is people want that opportunity in the community they love. And the fourth thing I hear about from everybody, no matter where I am, rural, urban, suburban, Republican, Democrat, they want more freedom in their lives. Now, we might define that a little bit differently. I might define freedom as giving women the ability to make decisions over their own bodies, your ability to marry. The ability to marry who you love and be comfortable in your own skin and who you are. While we may have honest differences and debates about those things, freedom is a central theme throughout all communities I visit. I think that's one of the reasons why we've been successful in this business, why Governor Wolf was successful, is because if you understand those four threads that sort of bind everybody together, you stop looking at our Commonwealth as areas of differences, the way the media and other outside agitators would like you to look at it, and you find the common humanity in one another. Again, back to Penn, back to the hope that he had for this place, an area where we could find that common humanity, and it would be centered around making sure everybody felt warm and welcome and involved and invited here in Pennsylvania.
So I love that story about William Penn in the office, and not just because I'm a historian, but you talked about having this brief moment of time where you had a little time, and then all of a sudden the impressive work happened. And none of us, except for Governor Wolf, have been in that seat to understand all the pressures and demands you face, particularly on your time. I can only imagine, I've just been in the back waiting for you, that you're going from one meeting to the next, one speech to the next. Could you take us into what it's like to make decisions as a governor? You're in a room filled with people who believe in evidence-based research and that this evidence can help promote useful knowledge. How, as governor, do you make a decision, and how do you use evidence to help and get enough evidence you can trust to make an informed decision?
I think the fundamental responsibility of an executive, of a governor, is to make decisions. The entire system grinds to a halt if you're paralyzed with fear or if you're paralyzed with inaction. You've got to make decisions. And so every single day, when something comes to my desk, you have to make a decision. And I will tell you, Governor Wolf knows this, none of them are easy, because the easy decisions get made by the 80,000 people that work for you in the Commonwealth. Mm-hmm. You only get the hard ones. So you have to make decisions. And so I am in a constant mode of taking in information and then spitting out an answer. Yes, no, or we need more time, we need more information in order to make an informed decision. I believe in informed decisions. I believe in data. I believe in science. I know that not everybody does nowadays, but I still do. And the way I make decisions is to surround myself with a whole lot of people who have different worldviews than me, who come from different walks of life than me, maybe registered different parties than me. And I enjoy sitting around the conference table in the governor's office more than, solely behind the desk, and debating and discussing these things with my team and with outside experts who we bring in to help us make decisions. And I recognize that in every meeting I have, and typically they're between 20 and 30 minutes, I don't like very long meetings, after we've had all the information laid out, after I've done my reading, which I tend to do prior to these discussions, my job at the end of the meeting is to say A or B, this way or that way, and make a concrete decision, and then trust my team to go out and execute on it. I am not a micromanager by any stretch, but I do enjoy getting in the weeds of the information. I enjoy understanding it, and I enjoy taking my own experiences out in the community and bringing that to the decisions that need to be made in order to execute. This manifests itself in different ways. In emergency situations like I-95, where someone needed to make a decision, we were going to go this way and we were going to get it done and get it done quickly. And then in broader policy discussions in terms of how to move a bigger issue forward. One thing that I appreciate so much about this job are the people I get to surround myself with every day. The smart people that challenge me, the smart people that disagree with me. I find through that process, we're able to make better decisions, more informed decisions. And I think that is my responsibility, is to make decisions for the people of Pennsylvania every day, and to do so with as much knowledge as humanly possible. I'll close this answer with this. I remember reading a long time ago a book written by General Colin Powell. Mm-hmm. General Powell wrote a section that always stuck with me. I don't remember if it was a section of a chapter or a whole chapter about how he makes decisions. And he talked about the information flow that any executive, in his case a general, has to deal with. And having 0 amount of information is none. Having 10 amount of information is the most information you can have. The problem with making a decision at 0 is it's a stupid decision. It's uninformed. Mm-hmm. At 10, the decision has probably already been made for you because all the information's come to light and the issue has kind of moved on. I think about that all the time when I'm making decisions. So I kind of want to be in that 4, 5, 6 sweet spot. 6 is ideal. 4 sometimes is necessary in an emergency situation. But the bottom line here is you want to have enough information to make an informed decision. You want to have a spirited debate with people who disagree with you. But then you have to remember that your job is to make decisions and keep the process moving along and allow your team to execute. And I thought General Powell's approach was really helpful to me as I was sort of starting out in this business, and has really stuck with me all these years.
Thanks. So we're limited on time, so I just want to ask a couple more questions. The first is to just broaden out your view on governing. And As governor, you're the executive, you have a lot of decisions to make, but you also have to work with there are checks and balances. There's a legislature, there's a Supreme Court that here in Pennsylvania is elected. What do you see is the proper role for an executive in a democracy and the relationship between an executive and a legislature?
You are in a place where we still have checks and balances. So our government still works that way. And I respect checks and balances. I really do. I may not love the daily grind of checks and balances, but boy, oh boy, is it important. Look, I was last year the only governor in the entire country with a divided legislature, Senate led by Republicans, House led by Democrats. I think now there's 2 other states, if I'm not mistaken, that have divided legislatures. So for any bill to reach my desk, it needs Republican and Democratic votes. So I am mindful that every day when I go to work, I need to be able to build a coalition of Republicans and Democrats alike. So I start the conversation by believing the executive, the governor's job, is to lay out a vision, to lay out goals, to lay out a purpose in keeping with the needs of the good people of Pennsylvania, and present that, whether in a budget or a bill or what have you, to the legislature for their consideration. And by the way, also be open to their ideas throughout this process of something they see that perhaps I don't see. And then to work in a collaborative way to get those things to my desk. We've been incredibly successful at solving big problems that have existed for decades. Governor Wolf knows a lot of folks in the legislature love to talk about these problems and then not actually solve them. We have. We waited 20 years, but we got a big tax cut for seniors. We waited about 60 years, but we finally decoupled a fund that literally forced the state police and our road and bridge construction folks to fight with one another for a limited dollar. We reformed our pharmacy benefit manager system to put more money in your pockets and less money in the middlemen's pockets. We built on Governor Wolf's success and passed more criminal justice reform. Thanks to Governor Wolf's smart budgeting, we had enough resources available the day I took office to actually begin to fix our unconstitutional education system. These are just a few examples of problems that existed for a while that we're solving together by working with Republicans and Democrats alike. And the way I do that is understand that there's 2 parts of this. One, there's the theatrics of it all. And so I'm very willing to let Republicans go out and bash my brains in if it helps them, curry favor with their constituents, as long as they vote yes at the end of the day, right? And 2, I'm very open to their ideas. I put a blueprint forward on reforming higher education in Pennsylvania, and I specifically didn't put a bill forward because I wanted their ideas. They brought their ideas together, and we ultimately passed some higher ed reform that involved Democratic and Republican lawmakers to make the process better and stronger. So I get that there's the theatrics of divided governing that you have to go through. You all read a lot of that in the newspaper every day. I encourage you to ignore a lot of the theatrics and look at the results. But I very much understand the need to help people of both parties bring something back to their constituents, bring something back to their communities, bring something back to their schools or their neighborhoods that's meaningful for them. And my job as the executive, in addition to laying out the big, broad vision and bold vision, is helping them bring those things back to their communities, helping them feel a measure of success. Politics should not be a zero-sum game. It shouldn't be that if the Republicans win, the Democrats have to lose. I'm talking about in the governing. I'm not talking about in the electoral part of it. We can all win. We can all find wins. And so my job as the executive is to find those areas where we can all win together and allow them to get credit and allow our folks to get credit, and then everybody does better at the end of the day.
Okay. So I've got good news for us, bad news for you. We actually have more time than they originally told me.
I'm enjoying this. Keep going.
But that also means I've run out of questions. Now I have to ask you the hard ones.
Okay.
So when you look at governing and you think about effective governing, and you've been at every level of government, you've served in the state legislature representing a local community, you've been a county commissioner, you've been attorney general, you've been governor. If you could wave a magic wand and change something about either the structure of government or how government functions without replacing people that are elected in their offices, so you have to deal with the current people, what change do you think we could do to create a more efficient and effective governing system?
I have to keep both branches of the legislature? No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I think timeline for action, right? If the legislature were forced to act on things, by the way, I'm not saying things that I would like, but just forced to act on things within a set period of time so that we could kind of call the question on things and things couldn't get kicked down the road, I think that would be a helpful reform. I think that would be an important reform to the process here. Again, I'm not suggesting I would like everything that would come from that, but sometimes inaction does great damage to the needs of the people of Pennsylvania. And as the only one elected who has a window into what all Pennsylvanians are thinking, as opposed to just someone in a particular district, I can oftentimes see problems that exist for everyone that maybe some lawmakers aren't able to see in a timely manner. And so I would like the ability to say, okay, we don't have to agree on the issue of, energy, but we got to finally have a debate on it, and we got to finally have some votes on it. We got to finally decide if you're going to put a bill on my desk or if we're going to agree that we can't agree. And that is ultimately, I think that would be a useful reform to our system.
And again, you've served at so many different levels. You've been in and around the governorship for decades. Once you took office, what surprised you about being governor? Was there something unexpected or a perspective that changed by sitting in that seat?
I served as a state representative, county commissioner, attorney general, and now as governor. And I had a window into the governors over the last 20 years, including my dear friend Governor Wolf. So I got to see the work that they did, generally. And so I had a pretty good sense of the issues that confronted a governor. What I think I didn't appreciate about this job is the importance of a governor showing up and the importance of a governor letting a community know that I value the work that they're doing. Letting a leader of a nonprofit know that the work you're doing is changing lives. Letting those students know that they're seen and they're heard and we appreciate them here and we respect them here. I guess I'm saying I didn't appreciate the importance of showing up and how that would impact a community. And I'm very aware that it's not that Josh Shapiro's there, it's that the governor of the Commonwealth is there. Just yesterday I was in Meadville at a wonderful small liberal arts college called Allegheny College. Meadville is a community in northwestern Pennsylvania, and Allegheny College was really premier liberal arts college, was investing in skills-based training for local folks in Meadville. Their students and their professors were involved, but this is less about the degree you get from Meadville College, from Allegheny College, and more about caring about the community in Meadville. I showed up there to celebrate the work that they were doing and to make clear how much I care about skills-based learning and creating opportunity for people in communities that oftentimes get forgotten. And look, they appreciated the sort of ceremony of a governor showing up, but I think what those professors, what those students, what the people in the community really cared about and appreciated is, damn, the governor thinks this is important. This is important to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. This is important to our future. And that is one of, feels like millions of examples I've had along the way where showing up is really able to enforce and reinforce the work that folks are doing. I'll share one more story with you because I'm incredibly proud of her. My wife, Lori, our First Lady, who, as Tom and Francis know, is kind of a reluctant First Lady, a very private person, incredibly supportive of me, but not someone who ever looked to be out front. And a few weeks into this new role as First Lady, I asked her, what is it that you want to focus your time and attention on? She said, I want to go and visit different nonprofits that are doing life-changing work that get no attention. They're not in the papers, maybe they're not getting grant dollars, this and that. And she went to many of them, and one sticks out in my mind as an example. A woman had been raising money to buy, and this is maybe not a subject that often comes up in here, but follow me on this, to buy pads and tampons for women, young women and girls in school, because we learned that a lot of poor young women and girls would literally miss school when they got their period. And it's not something they wanted to talk about. Their parents weren't able to provide them with the products that they needed in order to come back to school, and the schools didn't have it. Lori came home thinking, wait a minute, we're providing toilet paper and paper towels and soap and all kinds of stuff to schools. Why aren't we providing pads and tampons to schools? Now, when Lori suggests something to me, that is more than a suggestion. That's, you better do it. She went and built a coalition that, for the first time ever, funded in our state budget free pads and tampons in every high school, in every state college and university, in our state parks, in all of our state buildings. And what she did was she took the work of this one nonprofit here in southeastern Pennsylvania and elevated that work to have an impact on women and girls all across Pennsylvania. One example of the many that she's done. So I share that with you because at the end of the day, I think showing up, listening to people, taking their problems and making them our priorities, that's the part, I think, of being a governor, being a first lady, I did not understand until I stood in the office, until I saw the impact of our presence out in the community. Look, I saw Governor Wolf do it, but you don't sort of understand it internally until you're in that role. And I take that responsibility as seriously as I do signing a bill into law or giving a speech. I take that responsibility of listening to people, elevating their causes, and making things happen very seriously, and using the power of this position to help make their lives better.
Yeah. So can I ask you for some... So can I ask you for some personal advice in a very public setting?
Sure.
As you know, there have been a number of decisions that have impacted universities and research institutions. And one of the things that we're doing as an organization, we've been talking about what is the role for a place like the American Philosophical Society to play in this moment. What can we do to help have a positive impact in the things that matter the most to us? So if you were the CEO of the APS and not the governor of Pennsylvania... Yeah.
I mean, I am the patron.
Yes,
so
that's right. What would you do?
Look, I think it is clear to everyone right now, and I mean, let's just be really straight. Whether you voted for Donald Trump or not, it is clear that he is governing differently than any other president in our history. It is clear that he is pushing the bounds of executive authority. It is clear that he is trying to blur the necessary lines of checks and balances. It is clear that he is interpreting the Constitution differently than others. Whether you agree or disagree with that, I think we can all agree that that is an accurate assessment structurally of what is happening in this nation right now. I also think at the same time, we are less bound to history than we have ever been before. We have been less bound to fact and useful knowledge than we are at any time before. And that is having concrete effects on everyday Pennsylvanians and everyday Americans. And I think if you are able to take the lessons of history that you all know so well here, the founding documents, the founding principles that we study here, and show people how that impacts their lives every single day. Not just that this is some quaint reminder of a yesteryear, but rather your lives are being directly impacted today because these foundational documents that protect your rights are not being adhered to. And this is how your life is being affected by that. This is how your life is being harmed by that. Or, by the way, you may view it differently. This is how your life is being helped by that. But having a conversation about that, where you're taking the theoretical, the historical, and turning it into practical impacts on their lives, I think that would be the most helpful thing this society could do right now. We shouldn't speak about... We shouldn't speak about checks and balances as something that Ben Franklin was fond of. We should speak about how checks and balances impacts your kid in your, public high school every single day. How checks and balances protect the rights of minorities in our communities. I think that kind of stuff is very, very important. And showing the practical effect of what is happening in DC right now on people's lives through the prism of what you know, the knowledge you have, and the history that is so unique to this place, I think that that would be very, very important.
So now we're back to the final two questions. It's good news for you, bad news for us. So one of the things that is at issue here, the founding principles you talk about, some people talk about them as first principles. These were principles that at one point brought people together around the nation. When you think about the divisions in the country today, not just in Pennsylvania, how or what might bring us together, perhaps not to agree, but in the words of Mary Beth Norton, who I got to interview a few years ago, and more recently Jeffrey Rosen, who was on this stage, the CEO of the National Constitution Center, to disagree without being disagreeable. How can we get there and build better collegiality across the aisle?
I think helping people see their common humanity. It goes back to what I said earlier, and understanding that voter in a rural community who might have made a different choice for president than you would have, they love their kids as much as you love yours, and they want their kid to get a good shot in life and have a safe community and a job in the neighborhood that they love. And understanding that there's a lot more that unites us than divides us, and I truly believe that there's a lot more in our common humanity that is uniting than dividing. I'll just share with you very personally. I mean, obviously, about 2 weeks ago, the governor's residence was, firebombed. There was an arson attack. The arsonist intended to kill me if he found me. My family and I were sleeping there at the time. For as traumatic as that event was, what has been so unbelievably comforting and encouraging to me and to Lori and to our kids is our shared humanity, the shared blessings that people have bestowed upon us, their willingness to invite us into their communities and share their stories of trauma or grief or sadness and tell us how they got through it and what they did to strengthen their souls from a difficult experience. I'm sure a lot of these people that shared that with us didn't vote for me or don't share my views on issues. But there really is, I have found so much goodness in the people that I have the honor of representing. And the lines that the media and others would draw and show divisions in are a whole lot blurrier than what it might seem. The kids wanted to do something for the firefighters that, literally ran past us as we were coming out of the house in order to put the fire out and save the lives of those who were there. They wanted to do something nice for them. And they said, well, we should cook them a meal. I said, well, I can't cook, so I don't know that I want to poison a bunch of firefighters. But we got together with celebrity chef Robert Irvine, who does amazing work. I think Patrick Murphy's here, he knows him. Does amazing work for veterans and others. And we served a meal to these firefighters from South Central Pennsylvania who responded to the call. At the end of the meal, I had taken the time to talk to each one of them. An elderly man, probably about 90 years old, a Christian chaplain from the Penn Township Fire Department in the Harrisburg area, came over to me. Now, you can't judge a book by its cover, but I don't know that I'm politically his cup of tea, right? He came over to me with this beautifully typewritten letter signed by every single member of his department, a small volunteer fire department. It was a beautiful note. On the back, this Christian chaplain wrote a prayer that was incredibly important to him from the book of Numbers. It happens to be a prayer that I refer to as the priestly blessing. It's a blessing that since the day our first child, Sophia, was born, I pray over our children nightly. We didn't share the same faith. We probably don't share the same politics. We don't share the same generation that we're from. Yet we were bound by a shared humanity in a belief in something bigger than us and also a belief in the goodness of God and the blessings of God that could help heal us. I see examples of this every single day. I wish that is the story that was shared more in our society every day, that common humanity, that common purpose, that shared love that people have for one another. I know there's some of you in this room hearing this who think, well, Gov's just being a little bit naive because things are really bad out there and people really are divided. Yeah, our politics are divided and our politics get ugly sometimes and our elections are tough, right? But if you actually had leaders taking their cues from the people and honored the goodness of the people of this state, as opposed to maybe sometimes drifting into some of the dangerous areas of politics, the world would be a far better place. So what I'm trying to say to you is people are good. They're inherently good. They're inherently fair. They're inherently decent, and they inherently care about the same things. They need to remind their leaders of that goodness sometimes. And we need to find our better angels as we go about our work every single day. I think you all can be an important part of that, reminding people of those foundational principles that united this nation, not just back in the 1700s, but have united us at key parts of our lives. Maybe most recently, September 12th, 2001. Finding ways to bring people together in our politics should be a cause of this organization. That is my hope as your governor. That's my hope as your patron, that we're able to use this organization to listen to people more and to use that plus our shared history to encourage leaders to be better and to do better and to take their cues from the people.
Great. Thank you, Governor.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. I think we got to get a picture here. All right. You're going to go this way.
We do now have a 20-minute break at the front of the hall.
Michael Faraday was
Can we gather? We're ready for the final session. Yoo-hoo. Can we gather for the final session of what's been a wonderful morning? Please remember to turn off your cell phones. Yes, so good morning, everybody. Our first speaker of this final session is Paul Romer, University Professor and Director of the Center for the Economics of Ideas at Boston College. An economist and policy advisor, Dr. Romer brings an unusual approach to economics, asserting that knowledge can function as a driver of long-term economic growth. This economics of good ideas requires specific conditions, different from those of other goods, to thrive in a market. In recognition of his work integrating technological innovations into long-run macroeconomic analysis, Dr. Romer, along with William Nordhaus, was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2018. Dr. Romer's talk today is titled, What Scientists and Policymakers Can Learn from the Input That Meteorologists Gave General Eisenhower. Please join me in welcoming Paul Romer.
Thank you. So it's been a pleasure to listen in to the conversation this morning. What I'd like to do is just throw away my prepared remarks and improvise in a way that tries to pick up on some of the threads that we've heard so far. I want to be sure to pick up something that Beverly Tatum, who's an old friend, said about indoctrination. And then I want to try and remember to link to a remark that Susan made, who's at Williams College. I don't know if she's in the room, but and I don't know her last name, so because she's a new friend. But she said something about the importance of social justice that I want to respond to. One of the surprises for me has been realizing that this morning, and it's so obvious, I don't know why it was a surprise, but realizing that there's a role for William Penn in this discussion. So I'll bring him in too. Now let me start with just a tiny bit of background about me and why I spent time learning about William Penn. Most of my work has been focused on this, what I think is really a very simple and very obvious observation, which is that the production of a new idea is really the most important economic activity that humans undertake. When someone produces, by doing some research, testing some possibilities, produces something like the formula for oral rehydration therapy, which is just a set of instructions that you can give to a parent to use to rehydrate a child who's severely dehydrated, typically because of a cholera or some disease. When you produce that idea, use a little bit of salt, some minerals, maybe a bit of a banana if you need to, but add some sugar too. It turns out sugar helps, and put that in the water that you give to the child. Don't just feed them plain water, because that will kill them. But the right formula for how to rehydrate a child has saved millions, I think tens of millions, probably hundreds of millions of lives. And the value you can create with that one idea boggles the mind. And it's different from the value you could create if you produced a bottle of Pedialyte, which is the store-bought version of these fluids. One bottle of Pedialyte could save the life of one child, but the formula can save the lives of hundreds of millions. These ideas have values that scale with the global population if we allow ideas to flow around the world. So most of my work has been focused on exploring the implications of that, I think, simple insight. One dimension of that is that science is the greatest thing humans have ever invented. It is a somewhat odd social system, and we don't pay that much attention to it. We don't recognize that it's odd. We just take it for granted. There's a very good book called The Knowledge Machine by a colleague former colleague at NYU, which he's a student of the philosophy of science. I think of him as a historian or sociologist of science, but who asked the obvious question, which is, why did it take people so long to invent science? Given its enormous value, why was it only in the last couple centuries that we invented it? And it's because it's hard to make science work. It's hard to get flawed humans to work together to actually converge towards the truth. But fortunately, people developed science, and it has changed our world, changed our lives. It's been extraordinarily important. And I honestly fear that we may be at a time where we could lose science. This sounds crazy, but look, think about Babylonian math. It's like, oh yeah, no, they had their thing. They were active for a while, but it all fell apart, and we still use 60 seconds in a minute, but beyond that, it went away. I don't think this is an inconceivable outcome. Then science as we know it gets lost, and I think nothing could be worse for humanity than were that to happen. So my remarks about Eisenhower and the meteorologists, and we're focused on what's going on and why is science threatened. What can we do to protect it? Now I'll come back to those things. But there was another part of my career where I started thinking about economic development, and my conclusion was that it would be useful to think about new jurisdictions in the developing world that people could move to, because new jurisdictions make it possible for people to change the social environment, the social circumstances, the norms that they live and worked under. I was very impressed by Penn's innovation in establishing Pennsylvania, and I named the concept that I was advocating for a charter city because of Penn's use of the charter for Pennsylvania, which was the first, as I understand it, the first constitution that had a potential for amendment to it. But in that constitution, he exempted from amendment the provision ensuring the separation of church and state. Now, from my limited reading of history, I think Pennsylvania was the reason the separation of church and state became an accepted principle in the United States. There were other developments that were given credit, but Penn was the one who really committed to this principle and recruited into Pennsylvania people of many different faiths on the basis of his commitment that there would be a strict separation of church and state. Now, how does church and state bear on the future of science? I want to propose something analogous, which is that we also adopt a separation of social justice and scholarship. That doesn't mean I don't believe in social justice any more than it means that the people who wanted a separation of church and state didn't believe in religion. But they believed there was something very important about the separation of those concerns. And I think historically that has proven to be true. So what I want to argue is that we've let these two things be conflated. And I don't think I fundamentally disagree with Susan, but her question about the importance of social justice could be interpreted as a statement that we need to blend social justice into all of our scholarship, all of our teaching, all of our activities. And I think that would actually be a profound mistake. And I think we've done it, and I think we're now suffering some of the costs of that. Beverly's remark suggests why we don't need that kind of mixing. We don't need professors to try and indoctrinate students about whatever social justice concern seems important to the professors. As she described in the story of Derek Black, Black benefited from being part of a community of people who had different ways of seeing the world, and he learned from interacting with them. But the classroom and the lectures by the professor, I think, did, as she suggested, did not involve and did not need to involve indoctrination. And to the extent that any professor might have tried to engage in indoctrination, I think the odds are very likely that it would be counterproductive. It wouldn't work. I talked to Susan briefly, and one of her follow-up comments was that we should think about social justice and understand it better, and that's actually something I strongly believe in. We should devote more scholarly and research attention to the question of how norms about right and wrong evolve over time. I think it's an incredibly important issue, but if you don't understand that process, you're very much at risk of doing things that will be counterproductive, that will undermine what your intent was. And I think we see this in this domain of social justice. Now, let me go back to what I had intended to say in my talk here, although I'll adjust it slightly. Imagine that I had been one of the meteorologists that General Eisenhower was consulting with in the lead up to D-Day. And imagine that I, as is true, I believe in what I would call moral activism. I think it's important for all of us to try to guide our moral beliefs as a society in a direction that I think unambiguously represents progress. A good historical example of this would be the kind of moral activism that led to the abolition of slavery. I don't think it's controversial at all today to say that slavery was wrong, but that many people in a different era believed that slavery was morally acceptable. Through some process, our beliefs about right and wrong changed, and that's no longer accepted as morally acceptable. So imagine that I, as a meteorologist, believed in moralistic activism. I'm trying to avoid social justice because I think sometimes these terms are provocative unintentionally. So I had tried out moral activism when I was preparing my remarks. But now, suppose, and this is hypothetical, but suppose I were convinced that the biggest moral issue right now is the degree to which humans inflict pain and suffering on non-human animals. I think it's quite possible that in 100 or 200 years, people will look back and see what we do with factory farming and with creatures like pigs who are relatively sentient and aware, the really horrible things we do to these animals. I think in a couple centuries, they'll look back at us and say, we were like people who believed in slavery. Now, animal rights, animal welfare is not my personal motivating issue, but let's imagine it were, just for purposes of discussion. Let's imagine that, because I think it's easier to see some of the issues here if we take something that's a little bit less current and a little bit less emotive. I doubt that most people in the room, I doubt anybody in the room actually gets up each day thinking that protecting animals is the most important thing to try and do today. So now imagine, let's go back to Eisenhower. Eisenhower was tasked with the invasion, what became the Normandy invasion. That could succeed only on certain days of the month that had particular configuration of tides and a full moon, but the weather was also very important. We know from some small talk that John Kennedy engaged in with Dwight Eisenhower, that Eisenhower thought the meteorologists were very important in this. Kennedy asked him, what was the biggest advantage you had in the D-Day invasion? And he said it was our meteorologists. So what did the meteorologists do? They had to make a decision as D-Day was approaching about whether or not to launch the invasion in circumstances where the weather looked very, very foreboding. Perhaps weather was so bad that it was going to make the invasion impossible. Eisenhower had anticipated the importance of weather. He had put together 3 teams, he and the other people in this process. There were 3 independent teams of 2 meteorologists that were then supervised by a particular individual whose name I'm now forgetting, but who had some experience in meteorology, but was really more fundamentally a geophysicist. He wasn't really a meteorologist, but he had good experience in management, and so he was tasked with supervising these 3 independent teams. One was from the Metropolitan Weather Service, one was from the British Navy, one was from the US Air Force. We know from the reports later that these teams fought with each other over everything. They didn't agree with anything anybody else said. The only thing one of them said, the only thing they all agreed in was that this man that they all reported to was a glory hound and couldn't be trusted, didn't have any good experience with the weather. So they behaved pretty much like the academics that we all know and love. Eisenhower, of course, didn't want to get drawn into those very detailed, acrimonious discussions, but got the summaries from Stagg. It was this man named Stagg who provided him the information. And as it turned out, the weather was so bad a day or 2 before the planned start of D-Day that they decided to postpone for 1 day. Then the team reached a consensus that there was an opening, potentially. The weather would be better on the following day. And so there were things that had to be set in motion days in advance, but they made the decision to go ahead after a 1-day postponement to launch on the 6th. As many of you know, the weather was bad that day. The skies were more overcast, so the planes that were supposed to drop troops in gliders in particular places many times had them end up in the wrong places. The bombing campaign wasn't as effective as it could be. The troops, when they landed, were all seasick. So I had always thought that the story was that the invasion succeeded despite the fact that they launched on a day when the weather was bad. But this is where you have to remember that story about the 2 people who were running away from the bear, and one says to the other, you can't outrun the bear, and it's, no, I just have to outrun you. What mattered was that the US had an advantage relative to the Germans. The Germans saw the weather being so bad, they thought there was no chance that Eisenhower would launch the invasion. So they basically took the week off. Many German generals went off for exercises in Brittany. Rommel went back to see his wife. So the Germans were very unprepared, so that the imbalance between the meteorologists who said we can do it even though the conditions are bad, and the Germans who said, oh, they'll never do it, was a significant advantage for the Allies. Okay, now this is, I think, this is where we want to be. We want our leaders to say, our intellectuals, our researchers did this incredibly valuable thing for us, and it's good that we have them. That is not where we are right now, and I don't need to remind any of you of that, but we have to ask why. So imagine I had been a meteorologist and had been in one of those sessions with General Eisenhower. And imagine at some point in the conversation, they were talking about food that they had to supply for both the troops and any animals. I don't know if they still use horses or use dogs, but imagine in this conversation, there's some discussion about the food that you've got a provision for the animals. And imagine I chimed in and said, General Eisenhower, you can't say animals anymore. You have to say non-human animals because it's discriminatory to speak of animals as if they are different from us. Now, Dwight Eisenhower seems to have been a person of, great reserve and strength, and I can imagine him gritting his teeth and nodding and then moving the conversation forward. But think about how angry it would have made him for me to intervene in that way. And ask, would he have really said to Kennedy afterwards, well, our meteorologists, they were our greatest strength. If I had taken this inappropriate opportunity to go beyond my mandate, beyond my function, and try to lecture him about animal rights. I think this is what we have done as researchers too often, and I think it is biting us very badly right now. The place where I think the damage is most obvious is in the advice that people from public health gave during the COVID epidemic. And we're now seeing a very serious backlash, I think, against public health, but expertise more generally, academics more generally, and a kind of pattern that opponents would call political correctness or excessive concerns about social justice. But these kind of interventions, like the one I described had I been a meteorologist, I think contaminated the communication from the public officials to the public. I think it also contaminated their own discussions to an extent where they made very bad recommendations. We're now seeing this the most interesting and probably relevant case was the decision to close schools and to keep them closed for as much as a year, when we knew at the time, everybody looking at this at the time, who ever considered a cost-benefit analysis could see that it was totally wasteful to close the schools. But yet, there was a kind of a moralistic dimension to the advice from the public health community, which is you just have to do everything. And if you can't close the bars, well, then you have to close the schools. That decision, there's a new book coming out about this it's an MIT Press book this month that will come out called An Abundance of Caution, which retraces that episode. And it persuaded me, I don't think the author is too explicit about this, but it persuaded me that this episode, for so many families who bore the brunt of a terrible public policy decision and who could see that it was wrong, it was doing enormous harm to their children and offering almost no benefit in terms of reducing the spread of the virus. I think this turned many of them against science, against experts, and in favor of a political regime that would attack the scientists, attack the experts, undermine them. So the excessive attention, I think, to something like social justice can actually lead to, I think, very bad policy and can especially undermine the kind of dispassionate attitude that we need to bring to bear to these public policy questions. That there are always trade-offs, there are costs and benefits, and it's a subtle process to weigh those to decide what to do. If you bring in a moralistic dimension and refuse to listen to the evidence from the other side and condescend to anyone who tries to suggest there may be another side to this, you will undermine the effectiveness of science as a system for making decisions, and you'll feed the kind of backlash that we're now living with against science and expertise. So let me just conclude by saying that I believe in moralistic activism. I think some of the greatest improvements in some of the most important dimensions of real progress have come not from the internal combustion or the transistor, but it's from changes where people decide it's wrong for us to enslave someone. So those dimensions of progress, and if you're curious, there's scholarship on this. There's a book called The Civilizing Process by Norbert Elias. There's scholarship we could look at this, but it deserves more attention. I believe that this is an important activity, but just as religion at the time of Penn was important, it's a different activity from research. It's a different activity from scholarship. We should draw those lines, keep them separate, and if we do that going forward, maybe we can keep science alive. Thank you.
We have a little bit of time for questions, and that should raise some questions. So, microphone here.
Yeah, Bill Kalen, Boston. I guess I'm still struggling. You had me until the COVID response, because I guess I'm not smart enough to see the moral activism component. I accept that decisions might have been, in hindsight, and maybe you're suggesting even didn't need hindsight, might have been made differently. But remembering that the healthcare system in the United States was on its knees and verge of collapse in some areas, and that the thought, I think at the time, was if the healthcare system collapses, there'll be all sorts of collateral suffering. And so, of course, the mantra was flatten the curve. And so I had interpreted the school decisions, for example, as one attempt to flatten the curve to the extent that these kids then go home and expose others. So can you help me with the moral activism component?
Yeah, let me just say that I think you're right that I haven't closed that case. I haven't really made a convincing case there. I think I can, but I think it would take more time. But on those specifics, there are some people who are now claiming, there's another book I haven't read as carefully by two political scientists who, according to the reviews, suggest that none of what were called the non-pharmaceutical interventions were ever beneficial. I don't think that is true. I think that some of these interventions, like the lockdowns, were important, especially during these peak phases where flattening the curve was an issue and protecting just the capacity of the hospital system was important. So I'm not saying, and I don't agree with anybody who says none of those things made a difference. But I am saying that, as many people observe, we imposed lockdown in many places where there was very little in the way of active infection and no imminent danger to the hospital system. So we applied it much more broadly with this kind of moralistic reasoning, not saying, well, let's do the cost-benefit analysis. It might be useful here, it might not be useful there. And by the time we got to the shutdown on schools, we were no longer facing the possibility that our hospital systems would be overwhelmed, and it didn't help at all. Children were not vectors for spreading this disease. They didn't get hospitalized. They weren't active in spreading it, and it was like a symbolic act that offered no real benefit. So read the book Abundance of Caution for more details on this.
Question here, the microphone? Yes.
Actually, while we're waiting, let me explain the sense in which I don't think I've yet kind of closed the loop. I think there's still something that has to be addressed, which is my conjecture that a kind of arrogance and a moralistic arrogance was part of what led to the bad decisions about schools, but I haven't established that yet for you. Yeah.
I wanted to return to the weather, not all the way back to D-Day, but to late 20th, early 21st century debates about global warming, now called climate change.
Yeah,
Because
I
it
got-
follows
I
a
got
very,
scold- I got
excuse me, it
scolded.
follows a very
but-
similar dynamic. But the chronology, it's preceding the examples that you gave, but similar disbelief in what scientific experts were saying. Also, originally, a lot of the alarm about climate change was raised about things that seemed abstract or not affecting human animals. And the concern about humans was put in slightly later to emphasize them rather than the polar bears. So it doesn't match the analysis you've just given, and I would welcome your comments about maybe there's a bigger phenomenon.
If you don't mind, I'm not sure I understood the sense in which you think it doesn't match. There's the mic is right. The mic's right there. Yeah.
It's older than the examples you gave, indicating a longer chronology of the problem, going back decades earlier, and the sense in which there would be a moral case about humans and their behavior seems to have been added in later. Okay. The original problem didn't have anything to do with that.
Okay. So I may have erred in trying to improvise here, but let me be clear. I'm not trying to make a case about the importance of humans versus non-human animals. I was trying to intervene about like climate change versus global warming, this is another place where you get scolded with this moralistic tone for using the wrong words right now. But I'm not trying to say that's the forefront issue or the issue we should concern ourselves with. I was trying to use it as an example of a type of moralistic activism that might capture some people. And I was trying to get you to think about the possibility that you might agree it would be wrong for somebody to inject that kind of moralistic activism in the middle of a debate about should we launch D-Day. Now, climate change or global warming raises a whole slew of issues that one has to think about in the context of what I'm saying. Let me give you one. If we believe in the idea of democracy as scientists, and if the voters vote to adopt policies that we don't believe in, that we think are harmful, how do we respond to that? I think that there's a tendency to want to get on a high horse and scold and hector and be moralistic that is counterproductive. And there may be a certain extent to which we have to say, if we're really going to support democracy, we have to accept the fact that we're going down a path which is not the one that we would have selected. And we still have to give honest, objective assessments of what that will mean. So we can tell people, this is what we think will happen to sea levels. This is what we think will happen to farming and agriculture. But I think we also have to be honest. I don't think anybody seriously believes that that will mean the end of human existence on the planet. We sometimes catastrophize as if climate change will mean no humans will survive. I think the evidence suggests that humans are very good at adaptation and will survive. It may be a less pleasant existence than we've had. It may be a profound mistake. I think it will be. But we have to decide, are we going to sacrifice support for science by offending people who make a decision that's different than the one that we would have made? Or do we still want to preserve science even if voters decide they're okay with climate change?
I apologize to the person who has the microphone because we are completely out of time. Let me just say that we've now got some real questions out there, and at lunch, I hope you can really have a debate over this with Professor Wilmer. Thank you very much. Our next speaker this morning is Mary Sarah Bilder Founders Professor of Law at Boston College. Dr. Bilder teaches property, trust and estates, and American legal and constitutional history. Her research examines the foundations of America's government from a legal and historical perspective. Dr. Bilder's first book, Madison's Hand, Revising the Constitutional Convention, was awarded the 2016 Bancroft Prize in American History and Diplomacy, the James C. Bradford Prize for Biography from the Society for Historians of the Early Republic, and was a finalist for the George Washington Book Prize. Her most recent book, and the subject of today's talk, Female Genius, Eliza, Harriot, and George Washington at the Dawn of the Constitution, explores the life and constitutional influence of Elizabeth Harriet Barnes O'Connor, a female lecturer and educator living in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. Please join me in welcoming Mary Sarah Bilder.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stick to my prepared remarks because I could talk about the subject for so long. And I know when you're coming up on the lunch hour, time is important. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm delighted to get to talk about Eliza Harriet O'Connor here. She believed that women would reach the college and the political forum, and her lectures influenced the Constitution's gender-neutral language, and she is an example of women who believed in education as a political right, and I was thinking so much of her at this morning's program. I always begin with her words, the epigraph of my book. The exertions of a female should be considered as presenting an example to be imitated and improved on by future candidates for literary fame. And she meant people that people would think worthy of writing about. And I have a picture book approach to my slides because I'm a restless listener. 1 slide per minute, so no one's going to fall asleep. Eliza Harriet's been largely unknown. There's only 5 extant letters. 4 of those are to George Washington. 1 is to Benjamin Franklin's daughter. That letter is owned by and here at the APS. It's the most important of the 5 letters. It tells us that Sarah attended Eliza Harriet's important lectures in the summer of 1787 and knew and probably supported her ambitious plan for female education. Now, I met Eliza Harriet in an entry in George Washington's diary of May 1787. Washington was in Philadelphia waiting for the convention to start, the Constitutional Convention, and he had been at tea at Robert Morris's house. And then he went with Robert Morris's spouse, Mary White Morris, and other ladies to hear a lady read at the College Hall. He later rewrote his diary and explained the reading had been a charity affair, because the lady, being reduced in circumstances, had recourse to this expedient to obtain a little money. He said her performance was tolerable. Unless one misunderstand that, that is, of course, what Mr. Darcy says just a few years later to Eliza Bennet. And so I personally judge it a relative success. This lady was Eliza Harriet Barnes O'Connor, who called herself Eliza Harriet. Now, when we think about the framing of the Constitution, we tend to think about the classic images of the framers, all about the men inside the room. And Jefferson described them perhaps somewhat ironically as demigods. And there are no demigoddesses here. But Cleo, the muse of history, was a demigoddess. She was the daughter of Zeus and Mnemosyne, the Titan of memory. And Cleo provided inspiration for female artists, often the first ones to join male professional societies. And Cleo reminds us that history creates power by selecting what we remember about the past. And I think we have misremembered the space around the framing of the Constitution. It was a framing generation that transformed a monarchical constitution to a free one based on the people. And the framing generation, the we the people outside of Independence Hall, influenced the way in which the Constitution as a system was imagined and drafted. And I've written about, for example, 4 Native Nation representatives who met with Washington and convention delegates prominently in the summer of 1787 and influenced the drafting. And you can see here the APS building in the picture on the right. And also about John Adams, who was in England during the convention. But here, every Friday in the summer, through the newspaper serialization of his works on the Constitution. And the image here is of the September 21st, the first public publication of the preamble, which is down there at the bottom of Adams's publication. Now, we have no images of Eliza Harriot, but perhaps she resembled her cousin, Catherine Hardy, who's on the slide. She was born in Lisbon, grew up in England, a member of the aspiring gentry, educated at a female boarding school. Her grandfather and uncles both had been admirals, and her uncle served as governor of New York and New Jersey. In 1776, she married John O'Connor, an Irish law student at the Inner Temple. He appeared to be a gentleman, albeit quite impoverished, with unverified hints of connections to the ancient Irish royal families. They came of age in the 1770s and 1780s. What I've written is the age of the Constitution. People were rethinking assumptions about who should participate in the state. As far back as Aristotle, the Western intellectual tradition had embraced an ideology of female inferiority. For example, influential educational theorist Rousseau explained, the whole education of women ought to be relative to men. And then he added, reader, I appeal to you, be sincere. Which would you esteem the most? A woman who you found employed in the proper occupations of her sex, in her domestic concerns, or a female genius, scribbling verses on her toilette, surrounded with pamphlets, political pamphlets of all sorts? A radical new idea arose in the English-speaking world, female genius, which signified that women had equal capacity, deserved equal education, and political representation. And there's many images of this in this period. Here's a few examples. The 9 Muses of Britain are painted showing contemporary female geniuses. The great African-American poet Phyllis Wheatley gained recognition, literally described in a poem as a female genius. And Catherine Macaulay, the great English constitutional historian, the first constitutional historian, is painted wearing the purple Roman senatorial sash. And so I always kind of vibe with her wearing purple when I give this talk. In London, female debating societies debated female representation. For example, in the newspaper, the debating call, ought not the women of Great Britain have a voice in the election of representatives and be eligible to sit in Parliament as well as men? And the Duchess of Devonshire became well known for her political activities. In 1786, Eliza, Harriot, and John moved to New York, the capital of the United States, and began an 8-year journey lecturing and opening female academies. In New York, her ambitious school emphasized the art of reading, what we would think of as public speaking, French, history, math, writing, and needlework. Her female school's extraordinary public exams were held at Columbia College with the participation of the Columbia professors, and then to make sure everybody knew, she wrote about it in the newspaper. But although she was very successful in New York, John's career decisions altered hers as they would for her entire life, and they moved to Philadelphia, where a convention was meeting to revise the existing federal constitution. So as constitutional convention's delegates gathered in the spring of 1787, Eliza Harriot gave the first public lecture by a woman in the United States. Between April and late August of 1787, in every Philadelphia newspaper almost every day, her ads appeared for a course of lectures at the university. Lectures in the university by a lady. She gave her lectures in University Hall, which was over at 4th and Arch, the location of many male lecturers, including for the APS, whose building had not yet been built. Her lectures promoted belles lettres rhetoric, considered the foundation for professions like politics and law. She read Milton, Shakespeare, Pope, And then important political reformers, James Thompson, Edward Young, William Shenstone, along with the influential lawyer, political reformer, and Orientalist William Jones. She always included the work of the most famous woman writer of the time, Madame de Genlis, the first woman to teach the French royal children, and she delivered the most important political speech, Demosthenes' Oration on the Crown. As the first public lecturer, she brought to mind the story of Hortensia, who had given an important speech in Rome arguing about whether women should be required to pay taxes at a moment 10 years after the Revolution when that had been the basis for the right of representation. Eliza Harriot, in the newspapers that summer, explained her purpose. Herself, the lady lecturer, was the example that in the United States, the ladies are found in the society of the sages of the other sex and would soon command the honors due to the professors of science. The toilette and the drawing room, the two traditional venues for women, would be deserted for the forum and the college. She predicted that women, through seeing female examples, would join the forum and college. There are over 140 ads and commentaries about her in the summer of 1787 alone. And Washington's presence at her May 18th lecture, which she managed by stalling one day so he could actually attend, led to accounts of her lecture going viral and being reprinted across the United States in newspapers. Now, that was not all she wanted. She had an ambitious plan for what we would think of as a female college, an academy of belles lettres with a governing board, half women, half men, run by Democratic majority voting, with the woman who led it, one extra woman, actually able to assert control. That woman who would lead the academy was to give public lectures to 300 people once a week. She explained the exertions of a female, herself, would be an example to be imitated and improved on. And it is this plan that she sent to Benjamin Franklin's daughter, Sarah. Now, I believe that Eliza Harriot's lectures and her proposal for this ambitious female academy, her prediction that women would be in the college and the forum, influenced the Constitution's stylistic phrasing of offices. If we look at state constitutions written prior to 1787, there was no uniform way to describe who should politically participate. Many political constitutions use neutral language, person or inhabitant, or generic terms like he in 18th century linguistics. Only a very small number used the word male. The initial drafts of the Constitution contained gender-specific language. Congress was to be two separate and distinct bodies of men. The pernicious 3/5 clause explicitly referenced inhabitants of every sex. And most importantly, the draft fugitive slave clause emphasized that men and women, he or she, escaping to a free state, would be returned to slavery. This is a testament to black women's agency, and we think later of someone like Oni Judge who would escape from George Washington, that the drafter who proposed that language could not imagine a person escaping without thinking of women. It is the only use of she in all of the drafting materials relating to the convention. But the final drafting committee removed every gendered reference. And these changes created a neutral constitution with a person, he pattern. Persons referred to inhabitants of every sex, and he was a generic pronoun. And we know this because the interstate rendition clause is written this way, and otherwise all of us in the room who are women can escape all crimes across state lines free. Never once does the word male appear. And so the text of the Constitution left open and unanswered what would be the relationship of women to the constitutional state. It left itself open to the possibility of female genius. But for some, female genius proved threatening. Enter Benjamin Rush, and apologies for giving this talk here. He had a remarkable, capacious mind. He was anti-slavery. He was involved in numerous reformist enterprises. He had married Julia Stockton when she was 17, and they had 13 children. and he served on the all-male board of a newly reorganized female school, the Young Ladies Academy. The men wanted to reform female education so long as they were in charge. And in late July of the summer of 1787, as Eliza Harriot circulated her proposals, Rush gave a widely reprinted speech, Thoughts Upon Female Education. It was designed to destroy Eliza Harriot and Eliza Harriot's plan. Rush gave the old female inferiority argument a new American twist, what historians have since come to call Republican motherhood. Gentlemen should direct female education. British ideas were un-American. French should not be taught. Young ladies should be educated, Rush argued, to be an agreeable companion for a sensible man, and the daughter or wife of an American citizen. And Eliza Harriot, with her Irish Catholic last name O'Connor, was clearly in his sights. At the Young Ladies' Academies, lest the young girls forget, the notebooks reminded the girls of the limited ambition on the cover. The end of a good education is not that you become a dancer, singer, player, or painter. Its real object is to make you a good daughter, a good wife, a good mistress. Now, Rush's opposition doomed Eliza Harriot's academy, and she moved to Baltimore, where her tickets to her lectures there were sold by Mary Catherine Goddard, the first person to print the Declaration of Independence with the signers' names and her own. And then to Alexandria, where George Washington supported her school and invited her to Mount Vernon. And then to Charleston in 1790, where she founded an ambitious academy offering sciences, astronomy, and geography, and may have again crossed paths with Washington when he came south on the Southern tour. And Eliza Harriot was not alone in her views that women were equal to men and that female education and public speaking was political. In 1787, the far more famous Mary Wollstonecraft published Thoughts on the Education of Daughters. And that same year, the constitutional historian Catherine Macaulay began her work on education, assuming female equality. In 1789, Wollstonecraft would publish under a pseudonym The Female Reader, designed to help women learn public oratory. And oratory became a device to allow young women to invade public spaces. The United States would positively receive her Rights of Women in 1792, and the image shows the Philadelphia Ladies Magazine, Volume 1, with Liberty being presented with Wollstonecraft's Rights of Women. It is in that text that she writes, I may excite laughter by dropping a hint, for I really think that women ought to have representatives, instead of being arbitrarily governed without any direct share allowed to them in the deliberation of government. Now, exclusion of women from voting was a custom, unjust and detrimental, as a widely reprinted newspaper comment argued. It was not yet a constitutional bar. Women, the editorialist said, were equal to the males, and they should not be obliged to submit to laws they had no share of making. Indeed, the custom did not exist everywhere. Women and people of color voted in New Jersey under a state constitution that said inhabitants could vote if they were worth 50 pounds. In 1790, legislation explicitly used he or she to describe who was able to vote, and 7 years later referred to his or her ballot. And extant poll lists show many women voters and some people of color. In 1793, at the Young Ladies Academy, Priscilla Mason, who could have heard Eliza Harriot 6 years earlier, gave a now famous speech. Mason protested the limits on women. Supposing we are possessed of all the talents of the orator in the highest perfection, where shall we find a theater for the display of them? The church, the bar, and the Senate are shut against them. Who shut them? Man. Despotic man first made us incapable of the duty and forbid us the exercise. Let us, by suitable education, qualify ourselves for those high departments, and they will open before us. The trajectory was clear. Education, public speaking, Senate, and the bar would open. But this vision and Eliza Harriot's collapsed. In 1792, a financial crisis rocked the United States, and Eliza Harriot's husband brought her down with him, and she was forced to flee her school, fleeing debts. She moved to Columbia, where she started another female seminary devoted to what she called improving the female mind. She would die, however, in 1811 a boarder in someone's house, but even there she tried to exert control over her property, writing a will, signing her name, giving away her books. Now, what Rosemary Zagari has called a backlash, or this morning referred to a pushback, arose against women's inclusion in the constitutional state. The new genre of the written Constitution turned out to be very good at converting custom to sticky constitutional law. And so as states entered the Union, voter requirements shifted. In 1792, Kentucky broadened suffrage for white men, permitting men to vote without property or tax-paying requirements, but by now describing voters as free male citizens. In 1802, this new model grew dominant. Every new state between 1802 and 1876 to enter the Union defined suffrage by constitutional exclusion. The laws began free or white, and after 1820, almost always white. And they ended person, inhabitant, citizen. But what began never to vary was the word male. Indeed, in 1807, New Jersey reversed course, passing a law to limit voting to free white male citizens. By the 19th century, greater participation in government had occurred, but at a great cost. People of color and women now found themselves constitutionally excluded. What I think is that historians who used to call this the rise of democracy in the 1820s, well, it doesn't look very much like democracy. So what, and one slide behind, whoops, there's that slide, sorry. Whoa. Sorry, this always happens at the dramatic conclusion. Well, I'm gonna need someone to get me to the slide, because I only have forward and back control. That one, yep, thank you. Okay, ready for the dramatic conclusion? Okay, this is the slide that I lost track of. What influence did Eliza Harriot have? Well, she believed in presenting examples to be imitated and improved on. And we see examples following the path that Eliza Harriot tried to open. Here in Philadelphia, black women rights activists like the Photons sisters were educated, became public lecturers, were teachers. The first woman to vote under unrestricted suffrage was Utah school teacher Sarah F. Jones in 1870. The first black woman to register in 1871 was also a school teacher, Mary Ann Shadd Cary. In the place that Eliza Harriot died, in Columbia, in 1869, the South Carolina legislature invited any lady to give a speech on women's rights to vote. One woman accepted, Charlotte Rollins, South Carolina-born black woman, fluent in French and belles letters. Her speech argued for black women and all women to claim the franchise. She argued it was a fundamental and constitutional right belonging to humanity in general. The New York Times covered her speech but mocked it, and mocked her argument that women had a right to vote because the Constitution did not include the word male. In May 1787, George Washington heard Eliza Harriot deliver a lecture on the power of being an example. And she provided an example of female genius, and the Constitution was at least stylistically framed consistent with that theory. But her example also inspired opposition, and gradually the new written constitutional state transformed to become defined by exclusion. But who knows what ripples went forth from her lectures, her schools, her numerous newspaper ads. And as a path towards the college and the forum, I think her performance was certainly more than tolerable. Thank you very much.
That was terrific. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I want to remind everybody that Dr. Bilder is going to be signing copies of Female Genius in the Fells Room after the talk. So you can go get a copy and read more. We now have time for questions.
Oh, okay.
Yes, here.
Ted Steinbach from Louisville. Did she in addition to these newspaper accounts and ads, did she ever publish anything in print?
Yeah, it would be wonderful, and she's a great example of the difficulties in working with people who weren't part of places like this that kept their papers. I wrote a book on James Madison, right, and we have almost everything James Madison ever wrote. We have far fewer things on people who, for reasons like they're women or people of color or people who don't have economic resources, didn't keep their papers. She had no children, so and her husband dies, so she actually has no house to keep things in, and her speeches were not published, so it's mostly through newspaper ads. And we can contrast that with Charlotte Rollin. So Charlotte Rollin's speech had not been known. There's 3 copies in Canada of it, and even the people who wrote the women's suffrage accounts in the 19th century left it out. And I was just extremely lucky that Charlotte Rollin somehow managed, this is 1869, to get her speech published in her own little pamphlet. And so we know that what the New York Times said about it wasn't accurate, but otherwise we'd be just left with that. It's just that she managed to get her 4-page speech written down, and that survives actually in Canada in a library.
Rich Schifrin, Indiana. I can't help wondering what you think of the proposal of our previous speaker that we separate social justice from other academic concerns, because that might be taken to mean that we should not, in any level of our schooling, teach equality of women.
I don't want to offer any opinion about what a prior speaker would say or not say or be understood as saying. I do think that one of the things that, I work mostly on constitutional history and on what I think of traditional political history, and in working on this book in particular and on education in this period, I think I became more convinced than I ever had that this generation, the framing, founding generation, believed that education was a political right, and it was a political right because education has such possibility to shape who we are as a democratic country. So I think I'll just leave it at that, but I would find a hard time teaching about this without teaching about women. I suppose Eliza Harriot would say you have to X out all the men also, and then I'm not quite sure how we talk.
Hi. As Mary knows, I've read this book, and I can tell everyone it's a wonderful read, and you should all buy it and have her autograph it. It's an amazing job of research. It's very, very impressive. And I thoroughly agree with the point about the importance of education for the founding generation. That is the importance of education for the founding generation. I would make a slight comment that, in fact, there were people in England at the end of the 17th century who also were promoting women's education, not necessarily women voting, but I've been spending a lot of time lately reading that material, and that's also important. So that's all sort of a preface. But what I really want to ask you about is Catherine Macaulay. I think it's fabulous that you're going to work on Catherine Macaulay, and can you talk a little bit about your next project?
Yeah. I'm going to write on Catherine Macaulay, who I discovered in writing about this book. She was wildly famous, even though everyone's like, well, I didn't hear about her. But I was like, yeah, that's true of a lot of people who were wildly famous. She was the first constitutional historian and wrote a very significant 4-volume at the time history of England that was incredibly popular among the framing generation. And she argued for the justice and patriotic duty of the regicides, because she believed that monarchical government was inherently tyrannical and that we should have a democratic government. And she was very influential on many people in this period, people like Thomas Jefferson thought she wrote wonderful history, John Adams, James Otis, Benjamin Rush wrote her a fan letter, and then she agreed to publish it as a way to boost her American audience. She's a very interesting person, and one of the probably most famous people other than John Wilkes in this generation. And so, and there's been wonderful work on her, particularly by women's historians. Already, she was a good friend and correspondent by mail of Mercy Otis Warren, who was the first, arguably, American historian, female historian. So I'm looking forward to that. No. I'll leave that there.
And our final speaker of the morning is one of our inductees this week, Sylvester James Gates, Clark Leadership. You can applaud. He was elected. He's the Clark Leadership Chair in Science, the Distinguished University Professor, the John S. Toll Professor of Physics, and the Regents Professor at the University of Maryland. Dr. Gates is best known for his pioneering work in supersymmetry and supergravity. His co-authored book, Superspace, 1001 Lessons in Supersymmetry, was the first comprehensive book on supersymmetry. A former president of the National Society of Black Physicists and of the American Physical Society, Dr. Gates is a strong advocate for STEM education. He served on President Obama's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, the National Commission for Forensic Science, and the Maryland State Board of Education. In 2013, Dr. Gates was awarded the National Medal of Science by President Obama for his contributions to science and research. The title of Dr. Gates's talk today is Faraday's Lines of Forces, Photons, and Quantum Theory Simulation. Please join me in welcoming Jim Gates.
Well, good morning, what's left of it. I must admit, I have a sense of following a session of ice and fire, where we first were subjected to ice and then subjected to fire. And as a theoretical physicist, I wonder how in the world can I hold the attention of the audience, especially since you want to get to lunch. So let me try. Do I have the... I'm sorry, is there a, here it is, a device I'm looking for. First of all, I want to thank the Society for this invitation. I've actually been a member for a while, but this is the first time that I've actually attended a meeting. So let's get started here. You know, this is the kind of question that people ask when they're children. We heard something about that in the discussion yesterday about how do children actually have ideas? The answer, I think, is yes. Because I was 4 years old the first time I told my father I wanted to become a scientist. So I think I'm an example of a child with an idea.
They believe that underneath the whole surface of reality, everything was created by God in a unified way, that if you opened up one little part of it, you could see how everything was connected.
Michael Faraday was someone who, like Einstein, thought in terms of pictures.
Faraday was different from anybody else. He had a flair for understanding his experiments, for understanding what was really going on inside them.
By methodically placing a compass all around an electrified wire, Faraday started to notice a pattern.
What everyone else at the time had been taught was that forces travel in straight lines. Faraday was different. Faraday imagined that invisible lines of force flowed around an electric wire. And then he imagined that a magnet had similar lines emerging from it, and that those lines would get caught up in this flow. It was a bit like a flag in the wind.
But Faraday's great leap of the imagination was to turn this experiment on its head. Instead of an electrified wire moving a compass, He wondered if he could get a static magnet to move a dangling wire.
I've never seen you like this, Faraday. You look like a happy child. I'm shaking, Newman. Underneath, I'm shaking. You see, John? You see? Yes.
This is the experiment of the century. It's the invention of the electric motor. Scale up the magnets and the wires, make them really big, attach heavy weights to them, and they'll be dragged along. But almost more importantly, he's inventing a new kind of physics here.
That was likely the most important scientific development that occurred in our species' history, because it's the invention of the electric motor, it's the understanding of electricity and magnetism, and it's basically the foundation of all of our high technology to this very day. So if you don't know about Michael Faraday, you might wish to learn something about him. He barely understood mathematics. There's no evidence that he ever advanced to the level of even trigonometry. So to be able to make this earth-shattering, epical discovery in science is a statement about the way the human mind actually works. And because he did not have the mathematical training, he relied on visualization. And that's something all of us do. And that's, again, something that came out of the talk about children, because that, to me, is the secret superpower that our species possesses to create this thing we call science. I, too, think that science is the most valuable thing that our species has created. I define science as the way and the methodology by which we will live more bountiful lives. It's the essential tool to reach that goal, as far as I can tell. But unlike some, I have been worried about science for at least 20 years. I gave a talk in 2005 before the American Association for the Advancement of Science, where I talked about the fact that I feared that faith-based groups would turn science off in the future. It was clear to me that there were trends in this country, even 20 years ago, even going back further than that science is at risk. So I agree with our first speaker that you can lose science, that we can lose science. And the tragedy of that is almost unimaginable. So in the case of Faraday, he actually had a handoff to another scientist named James Clerk Maxwell. And Maxwell built on Faraday's ideas. And one of the things that both Faraday and Maxwell understood is that there are invisible influences around us. We call these things lines of force. Nowadays, we call them radio waves, because in fact, all of our Wi-Fi is about these invisible waves that exist all around us, and yet we don't actually see them most of the time. There's a time when we do see them. When you snap these lines like a whip, there develops a kink, and if the width of that kink is just right, it will enter your eye, and you'll detect it as light. So the invisible becomes invisible under some circumstances. These are the equations, Maxwell's equations, and I know that a lot of people in the public, probably less of you in this audience, when you see things like this, you want to get your holy water and rosary beads out. But there's no need to fear this the way that lots and lots of people do. If I show you this, very few people have the same reaction. After all, this is something that most of us have access through to the concepts because we can hear. And therefore, there's this level of comfort and familiarity. But if I go back to that previous slide, nervousness emerges once again. So Maxwell and Faraday might be surprised at the image that you see in the middle here. This thing in the middle is an image that came out of two scientists in Birmingham last summer. For the first time, we had the technology as a species to actually see a photon. Now, you'll remember I said when you get a snap, and if the crest distance is just right, you'll see light. But if the crest distance is not just like, you don't see anything. But this technology, based on a quantum material, detected a photon. And this is the image that came out. And so when I saw this image, I was like, gee, well, Maxwell and Faraday would probably be a little bit puzzled, perhaps. And so I started thinking about the first time I met Professor Moniz, who's actually sitting here, was inducted today. He was one of the people on my PhD thesis examination committee in 1977. And what you learn in books is that light looks like this pattern of light and red and purple colors. But I decided, because I speak to the public often, I wanted to give the public a dynamic sense about what a photon would look like. And so I created this movie. It looks like a bunch of wheels and starfish moving along, performing perhaps an elegant or inelegant dance. And the way that this picture should be interpreted is you should think about being out in space and having a friend shine a light beam past you, and you decide to fly through it. When you fly through it, you see that one symbol when it was a perfect circle. And that if the crest-to-crest distance was correct, you would actually detect it as light in your eyes. So let me stop this. That's what that computer animation looks like. That computer animation was invented in 2005. Here's the observation in 225. And so I got it right. Now, what's really interesting about this example of visualization is that those of us who are in the mathematically enabled parts of technical fields, we get this ability to see the universe by using math as our third eye. That's how I beat the experimenters by 20 years to understand what a photon would look like, because I could see it in the mathematics. It took me to think about talking to the public, however, to cast it in that form that agreed with what the scientists found. I want to talk about quantum mechanics a little bit, because you hear the word quantum a lot in society these days. Quantum science, quantum computing, quantum information. What is quantum? So let's talk about that. I recently gave a version of this talk in London, and so I was inspired to think about the bard. And I wanted to use the bard as a sort of a narrative device to try to invite people into understanding how quantum mechanics works. So you all probably remember Macbeth's witches out on the hearth with a cauldron boiling. And so let me use this as a story to explain something about quantum mechanics to you, to try to make it feel more comfortable, more familiar, more something that ordinary people can think about. So imagine that I fill up the cauldron and I don't turn the fire on. I have a little toy boat on the cauldron. I could give it a flick, and I thought the lights were going to come down, but I guess they didn't. But I could give it a flick, and if I don't put fire under the cauldron, the boat simply moves smoothly along the surface in a straight line. And if there were no friction, it would not slow down. But that's Newton's second law. And so there's a situation where you see Newton's second law. Now let me turn the fire on. The cauldron starts to bubble. Again, I put a toy boat on the surface, I give it a flick. Does it move in a straight line anymore? No, because it encounters bubbles boiling up and changing its direction and pushing it back and forth. Those of us like Ernie and I don't see David still here, we study something called relativistic quantum field theory. And in our view of the universe, when we start looking at things, we can imagine, and in fact our mathematics tells us, that particles and antiparticles pop out of the vacuum, just like bubbles on a surface of a boiling fluid. And therefore, the thing that we're thinking about as quantum mechanics can well be, as a device at least, can well be thought about the fact that empty space is filled with these antiparticle-particle pairs, which I'm showing in the middle of this cartoon. Now, a lot of people challenge quantum, well, they used to at least. It turns out the best tested piece of science that we ever had is quantum mechanics. And this number at the bottom here shows that. It's the only piece of science where you can make a mathematical calculation, go to an observation, and they match to more than 1 part in a billion. There's nothing else in science like that. So quantum mechanics, we can incorporate to the 4 forces of nature: gravity, weak, strong, and electromagnetism. At least we can try. But it turns out that the quantum idea doesn't work for gravity. And that's why you may hear from time to time discussions about a quantum theory of gravity. We physicists are looking for that thing. So I'm going to speed up a little bit because I know you're hungry and we've gone a little bit over time, but let me get past. This is my Uncle Albert. He's my hero Maximus in science. So I've tried to model my career to some degree to thinking about how he got science done. And so here are some of his equations, because I just want to run them past you one more time. Think of these as musical scores. And so the question should be, what stories are these scores telling you? Well, they're telling you that we live in a universe that could have started with a Big Bang. That's what you see in this cartoon. You also tells us that gravity is actually the curvature of something we call space-time. And then he also his equations also tell us that if you look at two things like black holes bumping into each other, they can generate waves of gravity. And in 2014, we measured those things. Now, David's not here, but David Gross and company, oh my God, he is here. David Gross and company back in 1984 invented this piece of mathematics. And I keep telling you, the mathematics is just like scores. So it's like David and his collaborators produced this new score asking questions about gravity. It's in the context of the mathematics of string theory, which I'm showing you with pictures. This is not quite the way that David and his collaborators described it. But you know, when you get a piece of music, other composers can give a variation on a theme. So I'm giving you a variation on David's 1984 paper. And what we see is that there are two kind of waves here. These waves that wind around and the ones that stay still. They're called closed. The first one is called a static mode, and the second one is right mover. We can relate these properties to particles from the mathematics that comes out of this. They look like the kinds of particles that we see in the standard model. And so a number of us have been working on these things, and there's a more complicated model that looks like this. This is not quite what David did, but working with a physicist named Warren Siegel in 1988, we did a variation on the theme, and we found out we could put left movers in. So we have standing waves, left movers, right movers. And when you put the left movers in, remarkably enough, these mathematics don't describe theories with 10 dimensions. They describe theories with 4. Now, some of you have probably heard that string theory has always got these extra dimensions in it. Well, that's because people don't play around with our variation. If they had, and if they would, they would find that out. Now, this doesn't get us all the way to the end of the story. Let me go back here. This is what the list of standard particles, model particles, look like in nature. Up in the lower left-hand corner, you see what we call matter, the electron, the muon. These are all particles that make up UFs. Up in the upper right-hand corner are the particles that cause the ones in the lower to stick together so that you get atoms and molecules, chemicals, bonds, and eventually us. But you have to have both of these kinds of things to get to our universe. Here's another picture of a possible universe. And in fact, this possible universe is related to the mathematics that David was using in trying to explain how gravity comes to be consistent with quantum theory. This is called supersymmetry. And this is actually what I do. This is where my core expertise is. As was mentioned in the introduction, I wrote the MIT's first comprehensive book on the mathematics that you're looking at here. So I also did a postdoc at Caltech under the tutelage of this guy. This is Richard Feynman, a very famous physicist. And if someone asks me after the break, I'll tell you some of my own personal Feynman stories. But Feynman pushed us to think about gravity and quantum mechanics, just like Stephen Hawking pushed us. So here's some friends of mine, Chris Hull, who actually co-authored some work with Paul Townsend, who's also a close friend, and this guy here. Maybe some of you have heard of him. Many people feel that he is the greatest physicist of my generation, Edward Witten. Most of the public has never heard of Edward, but Ed is starting to get out a bit now. You can find him on YouTube every now and then, giving a podcast, which is very rare early in his career. But he's absolutely brilliant. And so Ed came up with this thing he called M-theory, which was supposed to be the final knitting of the kinds of ideas that David started together with what we need to describe physics, M-theory. And one of my other mentors was Abdus Salam, a physicist and also Nobel laureate, Pakistani born, created a math center, a physics center in Italy where I used to spend my summers for 5 consecutive summers. And as a consequence, I had a 300-word Italian vocabulary at one point. And the first book I wrote for the public is named L'arte della fisica. It's only in Italian. But that Italian vocabulary is now mostly gone. However, this guy gave me this set of equations, not just me, but my entire generation. And when we tried to combine this with David's idea, it turns out that the mathematics of this is so complicated, we couldn't even get to the first base. And this problem stymied our field for about 30 years. So that's what the question mark's about, is what's the complete picture here that's consistent with what Feynman wants and Einstein? So at the upper part here, we see these 3 physicists who actually contribute to this thing called M theory. We see Feynman saying, well, you folks, that's a nice idea, but you blew it. You haven't gotten the complete picture. Because, see, Feynman gives us a particular way to think about quantum mechanics called the sum over histories. And the upper view is inconsistent with that. So back in 2005, working with a physicist named Michael Fox, I decided to look at these basic equations. These are simple versions. And Michael Fox and I learned how to turn them into pictures. Now, that's actually a very interesting thing because it's visualization. And what we've basically done in my research is to take the kind of equations that started with David and people like that, and we've got visual tools that allow us to understand the structure of the mathematics. And in 2010, the journal Physics World in England was so fascinated by this, they gave us the cover story of their journal. And now I'm going to just show you some pictures of what comes out of this mathematics. They're beautiful. We didn't tell the computer to make beautiful pictures. We just said, take this technique, apply it to the equations that are related to David's work, and see what comes out. Now, the last part of my story is that when you start thinking about equations in terms of pictures, you're doing something that is very interesting because you see, neuropsychologists tell us that the human mind devotes an incredible amount of its energy to the analysis and interpretation of visual data. So if you can take mathematics and turn it into visual data, then you have access to your part of that of your mind to solve the mathematics. And so, in 2020, working with my 2 graduate students at Brown University, we were able for the first time to exploit this ability to turn mathematics into visualization, very primitive visualization, teaching a computer how to visualize. The computers, and I'm going to, like I said, speed up here, give us back a bunch of numbers, but because we know how to take the math and turn it into pictures, we also take these numbers and turn them back into math, and it allowed us, running computer code, to solve a problem that is like the hydrogen atom that has, but in our toy model, it has 4.2 billion electrons, and trying to figure out what they look like. And we use this technique, we solve the problem that Professor Feynman gave us. We're the first people to be able to say the piece of mathematics that looks like it might be the metric consistent with David's and his group's invention of relativistic quantum field theory, including gravity. One of the most mysterious things about our work, however, is that we also discovered something else. Namely, in order to make these kinds of mathematical equations work, error correction enters them. I don't know how many people here are familiar with error correction. I know at least one person yesterday is very familiar with error correction. It turns out error correction is actually part of this picture making. And that means that we, for the first time, have discovered the possibility that there's a law of physics, not in computer science, not in something that we humans do, and maybe with only the other example being genetics, which we actually heard something about yesterday, but error correction may well be part of the laws of physics. And that's what happens when you let people from different demographics enter your realm of doing physics. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Beautiful pictures, yes. Thank you, and marvelous science. Insofar as I can follow it, I'm impressed, and I'm sure that there are people here who can ask better questions than I can. So please raise your hand. The microphone will come, and say who you are and where you come from. Yes, here. There's a question right here. Thank you.
Betty Ruth Walter of Philadelphia, and I'm wanting to know if you have consulted with Sheldon Cooper on the development of these pictures.
So I've never actually seen The Big Bang Theory. Part of the reason is because, well, my wife is a physician, so she has some opinions about the COVID experience we all went through that I think are at variance of things we've heard earlier today. But she tells people that her husband makes things up for a living, but because it's mathematics, no one can tell him it's wrong. So how do I feel about Sheldon Cooper? I've never actually seen the character, and we in my family don't watch the show. We've never watched the show because my wife claims, and she's been asked this question many friends, she claims that the show makes fun of our family. And David knows my wife, by the way.
Alan Spradling, Baltimore. Well, when Einstein, did general relativity, there was this famous experiment where they measured the bending at the next eclipse, whatever. And the big criticism of some of the physics that you've been telling us is just it doesn't have an experiment that could just show that all your beautiful stuff is right. And because you seem to be getting closer to such a day, do you see that is going to be possible, that could turn the everyone onto your side of understanding that this is the right direction for physics to be going?
Well, I'm not so arrogant to be able to say that's actually something that's I'm wedded to. I can tell you the following. Well, first of all, on the first part of your question, I actually wrote a book 4 years ago, called Proving Einstein Right. And it's actually, it's not about Einstein, it's about the astronomers that you're talking about. We followed them over the course of a decade. My co-author is a novelist, because I always wanted to write a book like David Sobel's Longitude, and I knew I couldn't do that alone. And so I have this book out there that anyone can go read. So I know this history that you're talking very well. What I can tell you is that I am, I guess you would call me a concrete physicist, in the sense that I understand that where I do my work is not necessarily in reality. In fact, I call it mathicality, because it exists between mathematics and reality. And it only becomes reality when the high bar of science is passed. And that high bar is very simple. Can you measure? Can you observe the implications of it? And so until that happens, this will be beautiful mathematics. It will probably give us some hints of new technology, because I showed you the beginning about Maxwell's equations, and the reason for that is that when Faraday completed his visualization of how light works, there was 15 years before he could convince the rest of the scientific community that he's right. And so I have been of the opinion that if string theory, because that's really what I've been talking about here, is what's called string theory, that if string theory is ever accepted as a piece of reality, as a piece of real physics, it will only come about from a confluence of many different sorts of observations. I don't think we're ever actually going to see the strings themselves, because the minuscule nature is so extreme, but we can see the implications of that and possibly find some predictions. I can give you one prediction, by the way. It turns out that the kind of string that, the variation that I did on David's work, that particular set of mathematics demands dark matter. It is mathematically inconsistent with those equations unless dark matter exists. Well, we got a lot of experimental evidence that dark matter exists.
One quick question in the balcony.
Thank you very much. Samir Zeki, University College London. I'm sorry, I'm mathematically illiterate, but I got the impression that you're implying that there is a connection between gravitational laws and quantum mechanics. This is an article of faith. But since this has been pursued for so many years and nothing has been found, I wonder whether you would consider the possibility that there isn't a good relationship between the two. Whether we are asking the wrong question, not we, but I mean the physicists.
Well, I agree that other people are free to ask different questions and would never forbid people from doing so, but since I have a limited time here on this planet, I believe that time to be very valuable, and therefore I don't try to spend it in ways I think will be unproductive.
Thank you so much. This is certainly not an unproductive morning.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. So we've now reached the conclusion of the meeting, and I have some thank yous. First of all, I want to thank all the speakers for the wonderful talks that we've had over the last 3 days. And then there are 3 people on the staff that I want to thank. I want to thank Erin Farrell, who's our Director of Membership. I want to thank Jeremy Schronak, who's been handling the IT. And especially I want to thank Elizabeth DeVore, who's our coordinator of meetings. She's only been here a few months. This is her first meeting, and I think you can see from how well it's gone how much we owe her already. So thank you to all the staff. And finally, thank you to all of you who've attended, and it's been a wonderful program, and I hope that this will inspire all of you to come to San Diego. Now, before lunch, just a few reminders. First of all, for those of you catching the 1 o'clock shuttle to the airport, they've brought a bigger bus. There's going to be a lot of room. So the shuttle will be in front of Franklin Hall. There are boxed lunches in the president's room. As you go out, they're in bags, handles on them. You can just run in there and grab a lunch and head out to the bus. So you've got plenty of time. And is there going to also be a 3 o'clock shuttle? Yeah, there'll be a 3 o'clock shuttle also in front of Franklin Hall, and you can store your luggage in the coat room if you want to run over to see the museum or the library, waiting till 3 o'clock. If you're interested in visiting the museum, there's a wonderful new exhibit, Philadelphia, the Revolutionary City, and Mary Grace Wall, who's the associate director of the museum, is going to be in the gallery at 1:30. So if you'd like to have a tour of the exhibit, please join her there at 1:30. And finally, let me remind you that there are baskets in the foyer as you go out. You can leave your name tag so that the APS can save money by reusing them. And also you can drop off your survey. Please do fill out the survey. We'd love to have your ideas and your questions. So thank you all very much, and I look forward to seeing you in San Diego, California, November 13th to 15th. So thanks to everybody.